You may be asking yourself, how is Kingsfield, FromSoftware's seminal series and the topic of this video, relevant to Skyrim? To that, I foreshadow, Kingsfield is relevant to a lot of things you might not expect. Moreover, I was hyped. No, I was beyond hyped for Skyrim. I was so hyped that for the first time in my life, I needed a rich open-world RPG to take my mind off of the hopefully rich open-world RPG I was anticipating. That very day, I heard tell of a brand new role-playing game which received glowing critical praise from Kevin Van Ord, a GameSpot reviewer who is very good at getting me excited about RPGs.
The superb combat and gripping exploration make it a modern classic, destined to be loved and talked about by anyone that has the pleasure of unraveling its mysteries.
Oh, Mr. Van Ord, if only you knew how right you were. The game was Dark Souls, and it was the spiritual sequel to a niche game called Demon's Souls. I worked after school in my small town's gas station, so I had disposable income, but $60 was still a lot to me at the time, especially since I'd just pre-ordered Skyrim. Nonetheless, I pulled the trigger on Dark Souls. I picked it up, brought it home, installed it on my Xbox 360. No, wait, hold on. I had the 20GB hard drive. I uninstalled Lost Odyssey Disc 2, I installed Dark Souls, made a character, played for about 90 minutes, and I hated every second of it. It was difficult. It was obtuse. The game trusted me too much, but it shouldn't have, because I wasn't smart enough to figure out how catalysts and talismans worked. Nonetheless, a few months later, after Skyrim was out of my system, I came back to Dark Souls, and I'm ever so glad I did. I fell in love with Dark Souls, and it's a love I've fostered for developer FromSoftware's work ever since. I appreciated its slow, deliberate pacing, its tightly designed combat encounters, and its brooding atmosphere, an uncompromising vision that has deservedly won the developer much success over the years. But we all stand on the shoulders of giants, and the Souls series, as well as its creative mastermind, Hidetaka Miyazaki, are no exception. A man is driving through the city of Tokyo on his motorcycle when the unthinkable happens. He crashes. Crashes are no joke at the best of times, and motorcycle crashes are not the best of times. Miraculously, he survives, banged up, bedridden, but alive. While sequestered to his bed, he has a lot of time to think, and since he's just been given a sizable insurance payout, it's probably a good time to ponder. After the end of the Second World War, Japan was experiencing a prolonged period of economic growth. A heavy investment in technology and a concerted effort to keep the yen from depreciating led to a glorious period of spending and excess in the 1980s, referred to colloquially as the Miracle. The Miracle was a very good time to, as they say, make hay while the sun shines. And that's exactly what the bedridden man vowed to do. With companies like Microsoft and Adobe going public around the world, it was a hell of a time to invest in software, and so he did. His name was Naotoshi Jin, and the company was called FromSoftware. From was fortunate to attract a handful of talented software engineers. It won contracts with a number of high-profile customers, including Japan's Agricultural Union. Things were on the up and up, until suddenly they weren't. The thing about bubbles is that they pop. The miracle of the 80s gave way to the lost decade of the 90s. The economic boom became a crisis. Various factors and policies caused Japan's stock market to crash, asset prices to plummet, and wages to stagnate. Many people, much smarter than I, could tell you why this happened and what the effects of it were. I can only tell you that FromSoftware was losing money, and they were losing money fast. With fewer prospects in their chosen line of software development, they looked to alternatives and found them in an unlikely place. One of From's programmers, Yasuyoshi Karasawa, spent his free time at work developing a computer game on the office's PC-98 desktop. Video games were taking the world by storm at this point, and they were an avenue Naotoshi Jin had not thought to explore, until now. He wasn't about to let an opportunity pass him by, and so it was that FromSoftware switched gears. What Jin wanted was to be at the cutting edge of gaming technology, and as we know, the early 90s was a magical age when a ragtag group of friends or colleagues could make that happen. From invested a lot of money into workstations and employees familiar with game development. From would split its workforce into teams, some continuing their commercial application work, and others chipping away at this game. Chipping is the right word here. It seemed to be one step forward, two steps back for the team, unsure of what kind of game they'd be making. With the hiring of writer Shinichiro Nishida, the team was able to repurpose the disparate assets they'd made into a more cogent vision. As it turned out, many of those on the development team, including Jean himself, were big fans of the Wizardry series, a pioneering dungeon crawler RPG that took place from a first-person perspective. Since no existing home computer or console could render the amount of polygons From was hoping to use in their 3D worlds, first person seemed like just the ticket. Not having to render a player character saved much by way of processing costs. However, the question remained, what platform can handle this game? Sony answered that question with the announcement of the PlayStation. From wanted to provide the console with a launch title. This meant less than 1 year of earnest development time for cutting-edge graphics on brand new hardware. They sent their pitch to Sony Computer Entertainment. It was messy, cryptic, and did not provide much by way of direction, but nonetheless, FromSoftware was granted a game development license, and they got cracking. With less than 10 employees in less than 8 months, FromSoftware delivered their final product to Sony. It was thanks to Jin's ambition, Nishida's vision, and programmer Aichi Hasegawa's experience that they accomplished this, surely along with some healthy work ethic from the remaining team members. The game would release mere weeks after the launch of the PlayStation. It was the console's first RPG. It was FromSoftware's first game. It was Kingsfield. Named after a golf course one of From's directors attended on a trip to England, Kingsfield sought to immerse the player in a virtual reality. Dark, slow-paced, and difficult, the game's release hardly represented a breakout success for From. Sales didn't turn a tremendous profit by any means, and there wasn't much buzz at launch. As a matter of fact, magazine reviews were quite unkind. It seemed the game's difficulty was a matter of contention for journalists. The unfamiliar nature of full 3D rendering further seemed to confound console gamers accustomed to 2D gameplay. Yet, in spite of that, and sorry to spoil this for you, there were 3 more Kingsfield games. Not only did FromSoftware not fail and disappear into the ether, they're still going, not selling 10,000 copies anymore, but 20 million. There's so much more to the story of FromSoftware and Kingsfield, so let's begin our dark journey right here with the original Kingsfield on PlayStation. Now, perhaps you've played the original Kingsfield. You might see me playing and think, wait a minute, that's not Kingsfield, I don't remember that. I hate to break it to you, but if you played the North American or PAL version of the games, you didn't play Kingsfield. Not in a Doki Doki Panic way, mind you, more like a Final Fantasy way. You see, the original Kingsfield was never actually released outside of Japan, but Kingsfield 2 was. In order to prevent mass confusion, Kingsfield 2's English version was renamed as Kingsfield. Furthermore, English Kingsfield 2 is Japanese Kingsfield 3. I just wanted to get this out of the way now. When I refer to Kingsfield numerically, I'm talking about the corresponding Japanese release, unless otherwise stated. Try to stay with me. This particular English translation ROM hack was made by John Osborne, quite a prolific figure in the Kingsfield community. Thanks for your hard work, John. On the technical front, I try to play my games as close to native settings as possible. Well, at least I recently do. I believe older games have a distinct aesthetic that often takes advantage of low-resolution output. It's harder to be objective about a game's art style when you stray from the intended way of seeing it. However, this is Kingsfield emulated at native settings. This is an actual copy of Kingsfield being recorded by my capture card. Good grief. That said, I've doubled the internal native resolution of the PS1 games for the sake of visual clarity. And also, if I have to play Glaucoma World for 100 hours, I'm gonna get a migraine. One other thing before we jump in. I've also altered the controls of every Kingsfield game. The games use a very rudimentary control scheme from before dual analog control was really a thing. While I may not be getting the unfettered Kingsfield experience, it's a small change that really makes the entire affair much more tolerable. With that out of the way, let's take a look at Kingsfield. Upon booting up the game, you get an introduction so PS1 that it makes the PS1 blush. Clearly designed to showcase the immersive potential of the PlayStation's graphics, Kingsfield boldly shows off the stone textures you're gonna be seeing a lot of in this series. It also shows you the unbroken first-person perspective you'll be spending all of your time in, from this intro until the end. An opening credits crawl fills us in on the basics. We're in the kingdom of Verdite, a place once infested by great evil which was slain by the hero later dubbed the Dragon of the Forest. A massive shrine was erected in honor of the dragon, and legend foretold that the dragon would someday return bearing magical artifacts. Many years later, King Randolph VIII would begin digging underneath the shrine, expanding it and dubbing it the Royal Cemetery. You play as John Forrester, a man in search of his father. It seems that John's father, Commander Hauser, led an expedition deep within the Royal Cemetery. What was he doing? What did he find? What will John find? These questions, and so many more, will be answered in Kingsfield. It's a bare-bones setup. A lot of information has to be sussed out from the instruction manual as well. The kids today don't know, but back in the Dark Ages, game stories and character backgrounds were often left for you to uncover in the manual. I mean, how else would you know that Cloud is 5'7"? The RPGs that inspired Kingsfield had similarly no-frills setups. It's just a framework for the game to do its thing. The first thing I did in Kingsfield, after getting used to the controls, was walk into a room, find a hidden door, pat myself on the back, and get mangled by a skeleton. Welcome to Kingsfield. There's something you should know about me. I'm stupid. When a game tries to teach me, hey, you're not ready for this yet, maybe you should get stronger and come back later, that only makes me more steadfast in my desire to die. So when the first enemy I see is a skeleton that can kill me in 2 hits, guarding a treasure chest, I become hyper-fixated on finding out what's in that chest, and also beating the skeleton. Because I believe that if I can kill this intro skeleton, if I can set this precedent within the first 10 minutes of the game, there is no challenge that I will back down from. There is no mountain I cannot climb. In facing the skeleton several times, I learned valuable lessons about the game's combat. I learned that enemies can be baited into attacking, creating openings. I learned that circle strafing will be a primary tactic. I learned that the game starts you with a magic spell, and I learned that you can shoot these spells through hidden passages. With that, I have overcome. A small shield. Okay. No? I'll take it. It's a just reward for a fierce battle. Kingsfield is a dungeon crawler, but it's not a dungeon crawler in the tradition of its inspirations. It's not turn-based, it's not grid-based, you don't control a party of 4. While it's never explicitly been mentioned as an influence, it most reminds me of Ultima Underworld. We'll get around to that one someday. Both games are far more focused on allowing the player to exert control over their character. There's a freedom of movement and observation present in Kingsfield which transcends that of its forebearers. It's also a game that opens very honestly. It's dark, it's quiet, it's unforgiving, and it gives you, the player, very little by way of direction. In some sense, this heightened freedom of movement is immediately intimidating. Being restricted to a grid at least gives you some track to move along, but here, the game really puts the ball in your court. You arrive via teleport sigil, and while your exploratory options are limited right now, each path branches into new areas, branching into new paths, all with their own treasure to find, along with a litany of enemies guarding that treasure, and there's nothing more threatening in Kingsfield than encountering an enemy you haven't seen yet. You just don't know what they're capable of. Initially, you'll face off against familiar foes like spiders, mummies, these plant things called man-eaters, which are a staple in the series. Before you feel too comfortable dealing with one enemy type, the game will introduce you to a new one, maybe this time equipped with poison, paralysis, God knows what else. Unquestionably, one of the Kingsfield series' most identifiable traits is its aesthetics. It's crude, it runs slowly, and for anyone who's played Kingsfield, it's recognizable from a mile away. It has a very fundamentalist take on 3D graphics. Geometry is simplistic, most of all being the environmental design itself, which is comprised of, well, walls and floors, cubes, 90-degree angles. Mind you, there are actual stairs and not just ramps with stairs painted over them. Ocarina of Time can't brag about that on the back of its box. But the graphics here are very straightforward, a kind of video game brutalism. In terms of poly counts, the enemies fare better than the level designs, but they're still what they are. They often act more as vague representations of the thing they're supposed to be, like this guy. I don't fucking know what this is. That said, think about the games that were coming out in 1994. On the Nintendo front, you've got Super Metroid, Earthbound, Donkey Kong Country, all gorgeous games that easily stand the test of time better than Kingsfield. But from the perspective of a gamer at that point, going from this to this was bragging rights. Even on the PC front, the biggest releases of the year were using sprites and raycasting techniques to simulate 3D. Kingsfield was unambiguous polygonal 3D from top to bottom, and that caused some problems. The first of these is just that the game runs badly. It's capped at 20 frames per second and often does not achieve that in some of its busier moments. With the PlayStation as unfamiliar hardware, the only way to fix this was to add or remove polygons. Polygons are simply 2D faces which, when joined together, create 3D shapes. Finer details such as furniture had to be removed to make way for enemy models, which had 200 to 300 polygons on average. The entire process of development involved this trial and error. They would boot up a test build, find out which areas suffered the most, and remove extraneous detail, resulting in long stretches of game that appear quite barren. This wasn't the only problem that FromSoftware faced. It's well known that the PlayStation's affine texture mapping causes a distinct warping effect when changing perspective in a game. The only way to counter this on PlayStation hardware is to subdivide any surface that has a texture on it. Each subdivision effectively doubles the processing overhead required to render that surface, but with the warping out of hand at some points, it was a necessary sacrifice. I've enabled DuckStation's built-in geometry correction. I know some people find the warping iconic, but it's quite jarring in a fully 3D space. Besides, we have it on good authority that From's intended vision for the game did not involve the warping. The game's texture work is also noteworthy, though not entirely for good reasons. The game is chock full of photo textures, which wasn't uncommon at the time. Their resolution is low, like 32 by 32, which, when mapped over these vast surfaces, often just looks terrible. Sometimes the textures are stretched, other times you can see visible seams all over the place. It's a mess, frankly, but it's our mess, and we love it anyway. My big problem with it is that I kept thinking, hey, an illusory wall, and then it was just a texture seam. Maybe it's a feature, not a bug. It's a bug. So it's hard to say Kingsfield struck a balance between graphics and performance, considering it looks like this, and it plays like this. But necessity is the mother of invention, and From brilliantly constructed the game's pace around this sluggishness. Combat in Kingsfield is a slow-paced affair. While first-person shooters such as Hexen and Heretic made a point of fast, brutal first-person combat, this is not Kingsfield's way. The combat in the game is slow and simple. Swinging your sword isn't just a quick little action, it's an event. Each room with enemies represents some kind of encounter. Sometimes you'll have one enemy, sometimes you'll have several different types of enemies. In any case, enemy behavior is very simple. They'll either attempt to melee attack you, or in some cases they'll fire a projectile at you when you're within their line of sight. The key to victory in a one-on-one encounter is your ability to bait attacks and break animations. What I mean by that is this: every enemy has a certain range, which once you've reached will provoke them to attack. As long as you don't get caught up in the attack, the enemy will be vulnerable for a length of their animation. You swoop in, bait an attack, get out of the way, then swoop back in for a smack before repeating the process. Gaining levels and experience, your strength will become greater, which will allow you to break enemy attack animations as well, meaning you don't have to run away after baiting them. In all of this, there's an element of risk-reward, as a single ill-timed approach to an enemy can be the difference between life or death. Aside from these basic strategies, your best friend in Kingsfield 1 is circle strafing. Play your cards right and you can have the enemies spinning for the entire fight, trying to catch up to you. Look at him go! It's also worth noting that you can't just spam the attack button. Well, you can, and for a while I did, but the game heavily disincentivizes it. The power gauge at the top of the screen represents how much damage your next melee attack will deal. Swinging while it's full will empty it, and you have to wait a second or two for it to refill. In the interim, you can swing again in order to deal less damage, or you can get out of dodge until it's full again for max power. Sometimes it's best to play it safe and be patient, and other times it's best to bum rush the enemy and hope for the best. You also have projectile options in the form of magic spells, of which you can learn several throughout the game at predetermined points. They have a bar of their own, the difference being that you can only cast a spell when the bar is full. There's no gradation of power with each cast. Fireball will do the damage that Fireball does. Additionally, spells require MP, which isn't a resource that's necessarily easy to come by. You can use rare consumable items or later on drink from this fountain on floor 1 that fully replenishes you. Both your melee strength and your magical ability improve by using the respective faculty, but it's hard to justify using magic flippantly. You really want to save it for when you need it. Alternatively, you can often lead enemies into traps or even each other's spells. This is a very efficient way of saving on resources while staying out of harm's way, and much of the game seems to be built around it. For the modern gamer, it might be a lot to take in without an in-game tutorial, but Floor 1 will be an excellent proving ground for you to test your mettle. The problem is that almost every encounter plays out in one of a small handful of ways, and the hitboxes aren't the most reliable in the world. Sometimes you'll swing, but no matter which angle you're coming from, it feels like you're never making contact. So the combat obviously won't blow you away, and it's not the most graphically impressive game in the world. But one thing Kingsfield has from the moment you kick off your adventure is atmosphere, and it has it in spades. I apologize in advance for how many times you'll be hearing the word atmosphere in this video. 25, including this one. It's difficult to explain something as ambiguous as atmosphere, since it's not only the product of so many in-game elements, but also the personal experience of the one playing. The game's simplistic design, dark fog obscuring your vision, threatening music, and the intermittent sound of enemies outside of your peripheral vision, it all contributes to a sweeping sense of gloominess. You feel like you're in a hellish place, a place you shouldn't be. Chances are you've already died at least once, and you don't know what horrific surprises await you around every corner. You find items with no explanation for their use, creatures well above your pay grade, and many traps. No problem, I've been through Sense Fortress, I'm fine, I can handle this. I can't handle this. For me personally, the best way I can describe Kingsfield is this. It feels like the kind of game I've seen before. I feel like I've been in its dungeons. The thing is, that feeling of deja vu is so faint and tenuous that I can't remember whether it was real or a dream. It's the kind of game where you see it as an adult and it unlocks memories, the sort that vindicate you. It wasn't a dream. All of those monsters that plagued your childhood nightmares, those sights and sounds that lived on in your subconscious, they're real. Maybe you were 4 years old at a family reunion in Omaha, sitting cross-legged on the floor, captivated while watching an older brother or relative play this game. And now, 30 years later, here it is again. It isn't that game for me, but that's the kind of game it is. Kingsfield is a lonely experience, which makes the scant few interactions with friendly NPCs feel like a treat. Even though they are terrifying and faceless and have 5-sided heads, they aren't trying to kill you, and that's good enough for me. Speaking to certain NPCs repeatedly will reveal new dialogue each time, before eventually exhausting all of it. This is, along with many other things, very reminiscent of the Souls games. If I stopped and made a comparison every time I saw one, this video would be twice as long. God knows we don't need that, so I'll be sure to focus on these comparisons later when the time is right. For now, keep your eyes peeled and you'll doubtless notice many similarities. Wandering this first floor will introduce you to Kingsfield's core gameplay. You'll arrive on a new floor, be overwhelmed by all of the potential directions you can go in, choose one, maybe die, probably die, etc. The focus is on exploration, which often involves a lot of guesswork and a lot of risk-taking. Thankfully, you can find save points in the form of these crosses, but it can be 20 minutes or more between these save points. This, as well as the labyrinthian nature of the maps, heavily encourages backtracking. In fact, the majority of your time in Kingsfield could be spent going down corridors you've already seen. You'll find a friendly shopkeeper on the first floor, and you'll be seeing his friendly face a lot throughout the game. He runs the only store in the entire cemetery. That's an odd sentence. His wooden walls represent sanctuary, another chance to stock up on medicinal items and delve further. Adjacent to him is the Knight Basque, ever warming himself by the fireplace, working up the courage to continue his journey. Relatable. Outside of exchanging gold for items, you'll find many of the necessary consumables and trinkets while exploring. These items can be anywhere, and I mean anywhere. In barrels, under beds, in tombstones, on bodies, dropped by enemies, locked in chests, and behind illusory walls. Oh, so many illusory walls. Now, as a seasoned Souls veteran, that first wall with the skeleton, I mean, it's just conspicuous. But for someone picking up this game for the first time back in the day, it may only be happenstance that you find these walls at all. Sometimes you can hear enemies shuffling behind them, which gives it away. Other times an enemy might casually phase through reality.
Witless fools, do I have to do everything for you?
There are so many of these invisible walls that if you want to play optimally, you'll have to do so while passionately kissing the wall the entire time. Some of the best treasure in the game is hidden behind these walls. Thankfully, there's an item called the Phantom Rod, which allows you to see which walls are fake. Sometimes you'll be in a room where it's just like, okay, my wall senses are tingling, and often you'll be vindicated for using the Phantom Rod in such an instance. Now, if you play Kingsfield strictly with the goal of beating it and not doing anything optional, you could probably do so relatively quickly. Well, with a walkthrough anyway. This isn't the kind of game you rush through via intuition. Much of the game's content is entirely optional and done purely to reward you with new, better equipment, weapons, or magic, which makes latter floors easier. As we'll discover throughout this video, the Kingsfield games have a habit of trying to make your life a living hell at the end game, so it's a good idea to be very thorough. The game's structure is split into 5 distinct floors, each one acting as a level of sorts. The floors all feature different designs and layouts, but they don't have any particular themes. Despite being somewhat level-based, progression in this game is anything but linear. Often you'll find a door or a treasure chest that's locked beyond your means. Get out a notepad and write it down, because I promise, I guarantee, you will forget about something. You'll need the Dwindleberry key to unlock the Sword of Plumpledump on floor 1. By floor 4 you might have the Dwindleberry key, but the possibilities have just become so numerous you'll completely forget about the Sword of Plumpledump, and you need that sword to fight Lord Grimbus. With all of the door opening and skeleton slaying, it might occur to you to circumvent enemies altogether. I've killed 50 skeletons on this floor already, I think I'll just scoot on by.
Halt!
In this game full of downright malicious environments and user-unfriendly mechanics, there's nothing quite as malicious and unfriendly as this. One time, this man-eater dropped a key, a necessary key. I'd killed so many man-eaters by this point I was in danger of breaking the Geneva Convention. This particular man-eater is in the back corner of a totally unremarkable room full of enemies. But this one had a key. All of a sudden, you realize that every enemy in the game could have a key on. What about that tree guy you left alive on floor 1? Did he have a key? Oh my god, I haven't even been looking at the ground. What if they're all dropping keys and I just didn't notice? Every enemy must die! Well, actually, that one man-eater is the only enemy that drops a key. But still, it added a deep sense of paranoia over top of my time in Kingsfield. Lots of specific enemies do have scripted drops for valuable items, so it's probably good to do a clean sweep anyway, but goodness man. You already feel very lost at a supreme disadvantage most of the time, so the fact that on top of that, when you reach the level end, you have to worry about all the enemies you may or may not have killed, it's just cruel. Thankfully, there are some basic guardrails that prevent you from wandering too hard. Oftentimes, if you miss a necessary key or item, the level will quickly bar your progress, signaling that you should probably head back down to a previous one and look a little more carefully. Even many of the keys, well, they lead to helpful treasure, like the flame sword. Wait, that's a flamberge. What's so flame about it anyway? Excuse me, I was saying that many of the keys aren't necessary. It's a small mercy in a game bent on feeding you to the grinder. You're actually at a pretty strong advantage if you've played a Souls game. What I mean by that is, you'll know to spend every penny you have on antidote herbs nice and early. This game isn't shy about dealing status effects to your character, whether it'll be old, reliable, that's poison by the way, or darkness, which is what it sounds like. There's a strong weapon later in the game called the Shadow Blade that does great damage but permanently afflicts you with darkness. I probably would have used it, but I wanted to capture clean footage for you, the viewer. My kindness knows no bounds. After getting used to all of these mechanics, further floors introduce new types of enemies and mechanics. The second floor, for instance, introduces you to these spiked ball traps. If your timing is excellent and you get real lucky, you can often make it through these, but otherwise you have to find a switch to shut them off. The second floor also introduces more complex rooms to fight enemies in, or arenas if you will. I refer to the fights in Kingsfield as encounters because that's the most helpful way to think of them. There's an intentionality in the types of enemies you'll face, their placement, how they act, and the arenas that you fight them in. Contending with plenty of fast enemies, you'll benefit from bobbing and weaving, trying to lose them behind pillars, and coming in for a swing when you can. Many of these areas look very samey, sometimes by design and other times by circumstance. The Keeper's Map is an invaluable tool, along with the compass in the top right corner. It's the only thing helping you keep your bearings much of the time. Sometimes it'll also help you understand contextual clues, such as deciphering that these gaps are crossable as long as you have the item that summons platforms. In many of the dark corners of Kingsfield, you'll find non-hostile NPCs that almost always give you tangible rewards just for finding them. They also give you hints regarding the story, which is still cryptic and difficult to understand, even in its simplicity. It seems the king of Verdite, Randolph, was actually digging deeper underneath the shrine in order to unearth artifacts of legend. King Randolph died suddenly and was succeeded by his brother and assassin, Reinhardt II, who also died years later. He was succeeded by Reinhardt III, a power-hungry individual. He not only sends soldiers, including Hauser, to retrieve the artifact, but due to the irresistible allure of power, enters the cemetery himself. As is the case with almost every FromSoftware game I've played, I say, thank you to people on the internet for piecing this together. Much of my understanding of the story is aided by Super Jump magazine contributor Drawn Stories. All of the information comes from either the intro, the manual, random scattered NPCs who live in dark caves and wait years for you to come talk to them, or some extraneous material that has never been translated to English. My favorite part of the manual is that this section naturally extends into monsters, which makes it look like the Scorpion is a major character. As mentioned, Shinichiro Nishida was a major figure in not just writing Kingsfield's story, but helping the project find its footing, period. It was some kind of a mecha dungeon crawler until he came in. He's mentioned in interviews his inspiration from classic CRPGs, including the lack of tutorial and in-game information. In regards to dialogue, Nishida stated in an interview, "We didn't make it like we have to do this because it's an RPG, we made it with the feeling of this is how it'd be performed normally. It's not make it this way because it's a game or do that because it's a game, but the feeling that when you talk to someone, they should respond like this, or I don't usually talk to people I don't know." When we hear virtual reality nowadays, our minds will often wander to bulky headsets, motion tracking, and whatever is going on here. Back in the early 90s, as 3D graphics became more commonplace, the term virtual reality was often simply shorthand for giving the player a direct experience in what felt like a virtual world. The Kingsfield development staff had used the term virtual reality to describe what they were attempting to do. With that frame of reference, Nishida's goal of creating dialogue that feels natural makes a lot more sense. Yeah, in times of crisis, people don't usually stand there delivering expository dialogue to you or let you ask 1,000 questions. It sought to give the experience of dungeon crawling. You'll probably never dungeon crawl in real life, but if you did, it'd be like this. It's far from perfectly immersive, especially now 30 years removed from its release. I mean, in real life, John would probably say, "Hey, have you seen my dad that I've been looking for this whole game? The whole reason I'm down in this hellscape? Seen him?" And they'd be like, "Oh yeah, I saw him down that hallway." And you'd run down there and it'd be like, "Oh, well that's grim." But it doesn't do that. It shows you a massive sarcophagus. In a cemetery full of slapdash graves, the inhabitant of this particular one was a figure of great respect. Evil seems to prevent life from flourishing down here, but in this gravesite, plants grow unfettered. Not only that, but this is where the best weapon in the game is found, a perfect gift passed from generation to generation. Hauser may have failed in his task, but his son still has a chance. Of course, there's no guarantee that this is Hauser's grave, but I believe it's heavily implied. With great graphics come great environmental storytelling, and while these are not great graphics, this is still pretty well done. We're not finished talking about environmental storytelling, but we are for now. Kingsfield is all about the player's experience, the stories you take home with you after the PlayStation has been powered off. It's also about the slap bass. That was the best segue I'm gonna use in this video. The music in this game rules pretty hard in all of its MIDI glory. Floor 2's music starts out pretty good with a glorious dark organ tune setting the mood, which really under-prepares you for the funky-ass slap bass on the following floors. It may not be a real harpsichord, but even on the Casio, that's a tasty fucking solo. Each floor has its own theme music, and they do become progressively more intense as time goes on. By floor 4, shit has most assuredly gotten real. The soundtrack is credited to 2 different composers, Koji Endo and Kaoru Kono. Endo's list of credits is downright exhaustive, 201 listed credits including TV series, anime, and video games. Kono's got Kingsfield. I think we know who was behind the slap bass. Of course, I'm only kidding. Group efforts deserve group recognition, and it seems both Kono and Endo belonged to a business called Sound Kids Corp, which supplied From with music and sound design for years. Like the graphics, much of the sound design is brute force, and like the graphics, it's totally iconic. A lot of it contains recognizable samples, but hey, using samples well is a talent all the same. Attacks feel nice and punchy. That is in no way small part thanks to the sword swing sound effect that sounds like a tiny jumbo jet taking off every time you hit the attack button. Is tiny jumbo jet an oxymoron? One thing Kingsfield is lacking is enemy sounds. They mostly kind of stand there in silence, occasionally making a swoosh sound as they swing at you. How about some growls? How about a scream? How about skeletons playing their ribs like a xylophone? The only person who really makes sound is your character when he screams after dying, which he will be doing a lot. And there, by the grace of God, if you stumble around every corridor smacking walls, avoiding falls, and stealing balls, like balls of steel I mean, you can find the Dragon Sword? But if you bring it to the fairy woman on the last floor, she'll turn it into the Moonlight Sword. If you've ever played a From game, you probably know what the Moonlight Sword is. If you haven't, you may not be aware of this storied tradition. The Moonlight Sword is a signature. In nearly every game From has developed, they've included some iteration of this sword. Most people's first experience with it will be in Dark Souls or Demon Souls, but it's been in Bloodborne, Elden Ring, even the Armored Core series has a kind of Moonlight Sword. For fans of the studio, there's just something fun and satisfying about stumbling across this weapon. It's a wink and a nudge to the player, a reminder of From's humble roots and how far they've come. And a lot of the time, it's just a badass weapon. Personally, my favorite version of the sword is in Bloodborne, but it's still very good in Kingsfield. On top of dealing a lot of damage, if you hit the magic button mid-swing, you'll fire out a powerful exploding beam. Timing is a little touchy, but it definitely gets the job done. And that's just as well because by the 5th and final floor of the game, they just said fuck it and placed enemies haphazardly everywhere. This, like the Moonlight Sword, will become a Kingsfield tradition. Finding the sword also unlocks a number of new areas via dragon doors. This means you're heavily encouraged to backtrack in order to find the absolute best gear before you march off to the boss. You might feel eager to get a move on, but trust me when I say, you need all of the help you can get. It's a good thing these endgame enemies are stupid, or else they might try to hit you. Things get pretty dicey by this point. I'd mentioned before that journalists were rather uncharitable towards Kingsfield. If you're charitable towards game journalists circa 1994, it's not hard to see why they felt this way. Just taking a look at what kind of game launched with the PS1, the Raiden Project, Battle Arena Toshinden, Ridge Racer, Rayman, Street Fighter the movie, good lord. What do all of these games have in common? Well, they're either 2D or they've already been available to play in arcades for years. Well, not Toshinden, but it's basically Virtua Fighter. After the initial shock of 3D graphics, going from Outrun to Ridge Racer isn't a tremendous leap. However, going from Eye of the Beholder to Kingsfield was. You could characterize fighting games and racing games as short-form experiences, easy to pick up and have fun, but difficult to master. King's Field is anything but short form. It's an expansive 3D world that demands your time and patience. Its concepts were unfamiliar to most consumers at the time. This is especially true of Japan, which favored console RPGs over the computer RPGs that King's Field more closely resembled. There was nothing quite like this. Your ability to make granular decisions in terms of movement, perspective, what objects in the environment you interact with, there's a lack of simplicity and clarity that places a great deal of responsibility in the hands of the player. Even for someone like me, an experienced video game player who's enjoyed many of the games that have iterated on King's Field, there's a strong beginner-unfriendly difficulty curve that King's Field forces you to overcome. No instruction manual in the world can help you do that, it's simply a matter of your own tenacity. So you've got this perfect cocktail of unfamiliar 3D controls, cryptic idiosyncrasies, and, simply put, brutal difficulty. Why wouldn't I just pop in Street Fighter the movie? Don't answer that question. I can't say for certain things were the same in Japan, but in North America in the 90s and early 2000s, game reviews were often based almost entirely on the personal experience of the reviewer rather than an objective measurement of quality. If a reviewer that's never played a fighting game is given Killer Instinct, he might give it a bad score simply because he doesn't like fighting games.
Is that all you're doing really is just pushing buttons.
3 out of 10.
I give it a 2.5.
And reviews like that can really follow a game like a stench they can't get rid of. The point is that reviews should be taken with a grain of salt. If a reviewer wakes up with a headache, they might be unfairly critical towards something that doesn't deserve it.
What's your score on JoJo?
JoJo's Dumbass Adventure gets a 4.5.
You gotta open your mind, man.
Yeah, open my mind.
Open your
Put
mind,
the
drop
garbage
the
in
gun.
it.
It's hard for me to say whether King's Field deserved it or not because it's been 30 years and hindsight is 2020. But I'm the wrong man to determine that. I find it difficult to hand out numerical scores for an experience as complex as this. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but that doesn't mean it isn't good or interesting or important. In spite of the poor reviews and mediocre sales, King's Field became something of a sleeper hit. You see, by the mid-90s, this passing fad called the internet was increasingly being used by gamers to communicate with each other. The hardest of the hardcore gamers caught wind of King's Field's ruthless design and began spreading the good word. Challenge seekers heard tell of this and found themselves drawn to the title. Because of its perplexing design and labyrinthian levels, King's Field became an early example of a game with an online community. Players would swap tips and tricks with each other, progressing thanks to the assistance of others. I absolutely love this because FromSoftware's fanbase still does the same thing to this very day. On forums, on wikis, through YouTube videos, exciting discoveries are still being made, strategies are being swapped. This spirit of community is a generational phenomenon, and I just love to see it continuing. By the end of the game, you're given some navigational boons that really help you find your way around. The first is an item that sends you back to the entry point of the floor you're on. This alone is tremendously helpful. For much of the game, you'll be trudging back through caves, trying to remember if you took a left or a right, looking for the exit point. This saves a lot of time. Not only that, but you'll also find alternative portals that take you to previously inaccessible points on each prior floor. The only real way to tell what floor you're on is to take out your map once you're there, or more simply, just recognize the music track. Floor 4 it is. Between the equipment and the warping abilities, there's a steady upward crescendo of progression that makes you feel like a god when you come back to the earlier floors. Enemies that represented such a threat can just be steamrolled now. You'll be much better at recognizing landmarks, and especially Floor 1 with the shop, you'll know it like the back of your hand. You'll meet all of your old friends, Wilfred Light, Basque Cries, Ozzy Ran Valgvi, Druid's Cross. I feel like my mouth is doing gymnastics saying these names. I've been so spoiled by Elden Ring, where everybody's name is like Rhonda, Rodney, Ranny, Ronald, Roberto. Of course, just as you're getting used to the cemetery, it's time to go take on the final boss. It's a tree with a stone texture and face. I don't know, it might just be silly, but I actually like the weirdness of it. It's kinda creepy. This foe is actually King Reinhardt III. He's been corrupted by dark magic, and it seems he's turned his own father into stone. The artifact he's been searching for is the Moonlight Sword, so he wants us dead. I'm not really sure what he's planning on doing with it, but I trust this guy about as far as I can throw him. And since he's a giant stone tree, that's not far. Anyway, this fight is just madness. In lieu of being able to design an enemy that doesn't act like this, they've just created an arena full of nonsense projectiles, faces spitting copies of Kingsfield at you. You don't really have the luxury of knowing why you're dying. You only know two things. First, Moonlight Sword the shit out of them. Second, when that HP bar gets too low, consume healing item. Even with those advanced strategies in mind, this fight is a big pain in the ass. Bear in mind, when you die, you have to go back to your last save. That's probably a while ago. The level of anxiety involved in just trying to stay alive is high. Eventually, however, you will succeed. He explodes, and you kind of confusedly walk around for a while, unsure if you missed something, before heading into the portal and witnessing the ending. With the evil vanquished, the sun sets in Verdite. The game basically tells you there's going to be a sequel, and Jon lives a life of eternal struggle, trying to become a better man. That is Kingsfield 1. I love this game. I hate this game. It's difficult to explain why I had such an enjoyable time here, as difficult as it is to explain the atmosphere, because those two things kind of exist on the same wavelength. It may not be easy on the eyes, it may not be easy, but it's an experience greater than the sum of its parts. The first RPG, which is the first game by a brand new studio for a brand new console. Kingsfield is hardly the product of a tried and true formula. In fact, it was risky and ambitious. Jon had vision, and the talented people who worked with him reined him in and made that vision coherent. The resulting game is something familiar yet utterly unique. It's the product of a studio determined to do something special, a studio with no experience, a studio with a lot of ideas and not necessarily the means to manifest them. The moment-to-moment gameplay isn't always enjoyable, but with Kingsfield, a seed was planted, a seed that will germinate in many ways, some unexpected, and for that, it's a game which I have the most immense respect for. FromSoftware's current managing director, Masanori Takeuchi, has stated that Kingsfield is the most important game that From has ever released, a profound expression of admiration when you consider From's body of work. The game didn't sell like crazy, but it sold well enough to recoup From's investments, pay their staff, and turn a small profit. By this point, From had developed a good working relationship with Sony, and with the PlayStation's international release approaching, they saw an opportunity to expand their fanbase. Jon and company got to work improving Kingsfield's engine, knowing that they hadn't yet tapped into the full potential of the PlayStation's hardware. Kingsfield had largely been set underground as a matter of technical limitation. For the sequel, Nishida wanted to create wider outdoor spaces. This would present new challenges in design, but the team pursued it nonetheless. Throughout the entirety of Kingsfield 1's development, key members of the team were already dreaming of Kingsfield 2. They were brainstorming and ironing out ideas that couldn't be implemented in the first game. It was decided that Kingsfield 2's international release would simply be known as Kingsfield, so as to not confuse audiences abroad. While localization would take an additional 8 months for North America and 18 months for PAL regions, the game would eventually be released in 1995 and 1996 across all territories. Reviews were kinder, sales improved. It still wasn't a smashing success, but it found a devoted cult audience in Japan and abroad. If you ask me, of all the Kingsfield games, this is where the series, and FromSoftware in general, found their stride.
ASCII Entertainment.
This is the greatest logo of all time. I stand corrected. From, you're missing a golden opportunity to bring this back. The game takes place on the island of Melanat, which exists in the center of this world's 3 continents. In ancient times, the High Elves built a holy shrine on the island, but monsters came from beneath the island and destroyed both the shrine and nearly all of the High Elves themselves. The surviving elves died from a poison which came to flow in the island's water. Millennia later, King Harvine united the 3 continents and began building his castle on Melanat. But an evil energy made its home within Melanat, killing many of the king's men and forcing him to retreat. Meanwhile, gods within the island warred for supremacy. The evil god Gyra and the holy god Seath. Yes, Seath. In the wake of their battle, many treasures and crystals are said to exist on Melanat, making it an appealing place for treasure hunters. However, once a person has drunk the poisonous water of the island, they can never leave. Still, a young warrior named Alfred went to Melanat and lived to tell the tale. He had gone to find his father, and while he wasn't successful, he did retrieve a treasure from within the island, the great Moonlight Sword. With this, he was crowned King of Verdite and ushered in a time of peace. This was broken when the Moonlight Sword was stolen and monsters began invading the kingdom of Verdite. A search was underway to find the sword and dispel the evil. In the ancient forests of Verdite, high elf writings were found claiming that someday, Necron, a demon on the island of Melanat, would seek the power of the Moonlight Sword. Veritable armies were sent to Melanat in order to find the sword, but none were heard from ever again. Alfred would tell his most trusted associate, Alexander, of his plight. With bravery in his heart, Alexander would journey to Melanat. His boat was destroyed by sea monsters, and his envoy were lost to the waves. But Alexander, against the odds, would wash up on the shores of Melanat. Kingsfield 2 opens with its cards on the table. You, Alexander, are not restricted to a dungeon. You're outside. Look up, see the stars in the sky, fresh air. You can breathe. Enjoy it while it lasts. Once again, a significant chunk of the story and background is entirely contained to the instruction manual. This one is a bit more detailed than Kingsfield 1, and I appreciate the increasing sense of history that surrounds Verdite and its gods. It's still quite simplistic, but it gives Kingsfield a sense of religious mythology that fits in with its overall minimalism quite well. The first thing you're likely to see here is a giant squid. At this moment, you have two choices. Go the other way, which is clearly what the game is trying to signal without a tutorial, or overcome. Babe, put on a cup of coffee. I've got work to do. Maybe I can just bait out an attack here. Okay, guess I can't stay up there. Maybe if I get out of his peripheral vision, I can just sneak some attacks in. Hey, a ball. Damn. Alright, I'll just bait out one of these. Easy. Now I'll sneak over to the... Uh-oh. Okay, you're telling me that this one hit me, but somehow this missed? Just grab the ball, and damn. This time, I'm just gonna run straight across. Damn. I'll go through the water. I mean, it's just fish. What are they gonna do? Nibble my big toe? After much deliberation, I believe I will go right for the time being. Having Kingsfield 2 take place on an island was a deliberate design decision. While the team wanted to keep the world as open as possible, they also wanted to include some kind of a natural boundary area, in this case the ocean. It's immediately obvious that the core gameplay remains much as it was. You turn slowly, attack slowly, search barrels, the stamina and magic bars are the same. It's familiar. What characterizes the Kingsfield games is your ability to instantly make a terrible decision, unbeknownst to you until it's too late. Not just the Kraken, the game does a pretty good job of letting you know that that's a terrible decision before you make it. What I mean is, you can just go the wrong way. Usually you'll be hinted that you're heading the wrong way either by a locked door, inaccessible area, or enemies that are just way too tough. The only problem with the latter is that usually you find out by dying. You really have to scrutinize the enemy's design. Am I ready for this? Plants and mosquitoes I can deal with. If I see those, I'm probably heading in the right direction for now. It's subtle and it doesn't always work, but for the most part your level of adversity is a good way of knowing if you're going the right way. The outskirts of Melanat are characterized by night skies, endless stretches of water, and maze-like caverns, as if to say, make no mistake, you'll still be crawling through dungeons. You're quickly introduced to the second game's magic system, which is a little bit different than the previous game. Whereas before you'd find fixed points to learn magic, in Kingsfield 2 you'll stumble across elemental crystals. Using the crystal from your inventory will teach you the next in a line of elemental spells. Learning new magic is quite a momentous occasion in Kingsfield. It's a very powerful resource with a lot of utility. I like that the fire crystal is located at the top of this tower, as though the crystal itself is being used as a lighthouse. Yoink. Hey, knock it off with the ethical concerns. The ships coming to Melanat are just gonna capsize anyway. If anything, this makes them less likely to come here. This being the first time you'll see water in a Kingsfield game, you'll notice that enemies in different environments have different behavior. These fish can't go on land, but that doesn't mean they can't ruin your day. The game presses upon you the importance of traversal, namely you can actually drop down from ledges and even kind of jump across short distances if you take a running start. There are tons of alternative routes and secrets to find for those intrepid enough to drop down. Just make sure you've got enough health for it. After some very familiar looking dungeons, you'll come across the central village of Kingsfield 2, and this is where everything changes. Dark Souls time. Dark Souls is a series of iteration. Each game takes lessons from the previous while adding new things, developing its own identity. Including Bloodborne and Elden Ring, there's been a great deal of improvements made over the years. Yet for many people, myself included, the original Dark Souls remains a favorite in the series. Its combat is far from the flashiest, its bosses are far from consistent, and its level design is downright terrible at times. What Dark Souls has is, in a word, interconnectivity. Now, to be clear, every game in the series and beyond, from Demon's Souls to Elden Ring, has some form of level interconnectedness. Shortcuts that can be unlocked, passageways that lead from one area to another, that sort of thing. But Dark Souls is the only game that features interconnectedness on a macro scale. Its world maps connect to each other in sometimes mind-blowing ways. It has one of the most inspired open worlds in gaming. The first half of the game in particular uses this connectedness as a navigational puzzle in itself. You're constantly thinking about all of the different routes you've unlocked or have yet to unlock. You need to get somewhere. Barring fast travel, there's so many different ways to achieve that, all with their own pros and cons. There's no such thing as a level designed as a path forward because there's no such thing as forward in Dark Souls. There's only this way or the other way. Well, until you get to the latter stretches of the game, but there's enough video essays on this platform to tell you where it all goes wrong there. The Souls series is the brainchild of Hidetaka Miyazaki. He joined FromSoftware in 2004 and became director on several of the company's Armored Core games. It wasn't until 2009 when his name entered the gaming zeitgeist at all. He was assigned as director on a project From preemptively considered a failure, Demon's Souls. Whatever issues plagued its development, Miyazaki turned it around. Demon's Souls was a success. Dark Souls, a project also under his directorial supervision, was an even bigger success. Several increasingly large successes later, Miyazaki is a well-known name in gaming circles. He is an incredibly talented storyteller and designer. His ideas are bold and eccentric. And Kingsfield 2 so obviously informs many of his design sensibilities that it sincerely blows my mind. Kingsfield 2 is a deeply interconnected game. Kingsfield 1 largely presents a simple and digestible experience. There are 5 floors. Yes, you can backtrack to earlier floors, but for the most part, you march onward until the end. Kingsfield 2 doesn't have floors. It doesn't really have individual dungeons at all. The borders surrounding areas are ambiguous. There are multiple entrances and exits that lead back to each other, sometimes in ways that I actually found kind of delightful. Sometimes areas themselves change fundamentally, such as the ice caves, which melt and give way to previously inaccessible passages. There are maps in this game, but they're not nearly as helpful as in the first, because unlike that game, Kingsfield 2 really takes advantage of the third dimension. The first game is very flat and horizontal. It's designed similarly to its grid-based inspirations. Kingsfield 2 is horizontal, vertical, diagonal, and everything in between. It's not enough to keep your eyes on the road, you really need to look up and down. Fall off a bridge in Kingsfield 1 and die. Fall off a bridge in Kingsfield 2 and find a secret door that potentially leads to more dungeon. You can hop in minecarts and cruise around. Horrible, horrible minecarts that almost always lead to your death. There are some amazing moments of interconnected design in this game. I'm gonna give you a spoiler here. Kingsfield 2 is not my favorite game in the series, but it is the game I was most consistently impressed by. There are several other ways in which it parallels Dark Souls, but I wanted to focus for now on the level design because it is as intimidating as it is a work of brilliance. We are saturated by Metroids and Resident Evils nowadays, so it can be hard to appreciate just how difficult it was to step outside the mold back then. There was less than 7 months of time between Kingsfield 1 and 2. In that time, they deliberately chose such a clever and non-obvious path in designing their game that it just puts a smile on my face to see it work so well. One thing about FromSoftware is that they never settled on what they knew. One game would come out and they'd push themselves out of their comfort zone into another direction. It doesn't always pan out, but that adventurous spirit is just so damn commendable. Kingsfield 2's village is split into several different sub-villages, east, west, and central, each one with different characters and different reasons to visit. Even getting from East Village to Central Village requires from the player a very conscious effort in remembering all of the maze-like ways one can get there. The village is far more inviting than anything we've seen in Kingsfield 1. Don't get me wrong, it's not a happy place, but there is a little elf man who injects sweet, sweet whimsy directly into your veins. There's also a shopkeeper here. It makes sense in Kingsfield 2 that there's only one shopkeeper located at this point. It was a pain in the ass in Kingsfield 1, having to warp back to the entrance to each dungeon just to get back to floor 1. Here, the village literally represents a central point in the world. You're not always necessarily close by, but you're never at the opposite end of the world either. The game also introduces one of the cleverest and most forward-thinking, quote, fast travel systems of its time. See, there are these towers you have to climb. Just kidding, it's a little Ubisoft joke for you. At nearly every save point in the game, represented by these crystals, there's a pedestal with an impression on it. Throughout the game, you'll find these items, keystones. If you're lucky, you'll find the gates associated with those stones, moon, star, and sun. Placing a stone in the impression of a pedestal creates a return point. Using the gate associated with that particular stone will instantly warp you to that pedestal. For instance, there's a save point right near the East Village. I placed my moon key in the pedestal, so anytime I suddenly decided I wanted to return to the village, I would just use the moon gate and instantly go back. The reason this system strikes me as so clever is because it's a perfect convenience without trivializing the game's traversal, which is a major component of its challenge. You have 3 keys, 3 gates. That's 3 opportunities to create warp points. You have to be frugal, cognizant of the choice you're making. Of course, you can remove keys from pedestals and place them elsewhere, but to do so haphazardly is a waste. If you know you'll be returning to a particular area later and it's really out of the way, then it's probably worth using one of your precious keys. A place like the village where you'll most assuredly be back 800 times is probably a good place to put a key. Or maybe you're so familiar with the surrounding area that it would be a waste to put it there. You already know how to get back. It's a player-driven fast travel system that beautifully cuts down on the inane backtracking present in Kingsfield 1. Just another example of this game's surprisingly elegant design. Among the rabble of the village are such lovable miscreants as Al Hunt. He's too fat to go down into the caves. Oh yeah, if fatness prevents you from caving, explain Blighttown. There's also several characters that give you hints about where to go next. I would almost go so far as to call them quests. For instance, one quest has you going into Termite Hell. The termites actually planed the wood here with a craftsman's precision. The termites made stairs? How do they use them? How would a termite walk up a flight of stairs? If this were Dark Souls, I'd already have an answer. Reaching the end, you'll save a little boy who gives you a key. Keys matter in Kingsfield because 90% of chests are locked. The game is effectively trying to gate your progression, although it is pretty easy to miss some of these keys, so you really need to keep a keen lookout. In order to reach that kid, you have to fight a giant termite. This brings me to another major difference from the previous game: bosses. There are actually bosses in this game. There was one boss at the ass end of Kingsfield, but for the most part the game was just full of standard enemies. Kingsfield 2 deviates from this, and I would say that it doesn't work out too well. First-person real-time melee combat introduces a host of game design challenges. As technology improves, many of these challenges are overcome, but they remain present in the Kingsfield games. Mainly, it's the repetition of player strategy. Circle strafing, baiting attacks, it all feels pretty mundane by the end. The second game does attempt to alleviate this by changing up combat, and in a lot of ways it works well. The challenge is amped up in the second game because it's harder to read enemy telegraphs and it's harder to break enemy animations. This means that the sequel's combat is much more dependent on player positioning rather than baiting and circle strafing. Enemies in this game move quickly and actually have several behavior types. As mentioned, some enemies swim, some enemies fly around. Humanoid enemies will often lunge at you, closing the distance and putting you on the back foot. Baiting attacks is still a good idea, but victory is more contingent on knowing what the enemy's attack will look like. This is a far cry from the first game, where enemies largely stayed anchored to one position, pivoting more slowly or quickly depending on their scripting. The enemies in that game were very stupid. They did some stupid shit. Enemies in Kingsfield 2 still sometimes do stupid shit, but they feel much more reactive, as though they're anticipating your attacks. Some enemies even have body parts which can be hacked at and removed, giving you some control over the flow of battle. The game is slow enough that if you play consciously and learn how each enemy attacks, you can avoid a lot of damage. Combat is still not good, but the variety in enemy types and enemy behaviors makes it stronger than the last game. That is excluding the bosses. Bosses in this game are universally just large versions of monsters that do unreasonably high damage. Usually, just to tip the scales, they'll also have small monsters infinitely respawning. Termites, hungry, stair-building termites crawling up your pants while you're trying to focus on the enemy. Pleasurable experience? Perhaps, but hardly appropriate given the circumstances. The bosses suck and exemplify most of what's wrong with Kingsfield's combat. Their hitboxes are bad, their HP is ridiculously high, and they are just repetitive to fight. Keeping a distance is crucial, meaning you'll be more heavily reliant on magic spells. The game also introduces a bow and arrows as a projectile weapon. This is nice because it's possible that you just won't find much magic on your playthrough, or you might not use it that often. Like the last game, magic power scales with how often you use it, so the bow is a pretty good option, with arrows being just rare enough that you'll want to save it for special occasions. So, combat, better. Bosses, bad. You'll find with the quicker enemies and nastier bosses that healing items are all the more important. I have a problem with this game's healing items, and the previous game for that matter. Medicinal herbs are cheap as dirt and easy to come by. By the mid-game, you'll have so many of these that it's hard to die unless you're facing a one-hit kill enemy or fall into a trap. The anxiety that creeps up when you're 30 minutes out from your last save is still definitely present, but it is undermined by the proliferation of healing items. This is an issue I have in all of the Kingsfield games. It's an issue I also have in Demon's Souls and Dark Souls 2. The funny thing is that Kingsfield 2 actually solves this problem, like in its own game. You'll recall that Melanaut is full of crystals, the same crystals that Al Hunt is too fat to go get. Well, you can find these crystals in your travels. Taking them back to the central village, there's a shopkeeper who's able to fashion the crystals into items for you, either arrows for the bow or flasks. Flasks are the bee's knees, the Estus for the rest of us. Within the island is a fountain. Quite beautiful it is, my favorite place in the game visually. Throughout the game, you'll gradually unlock different channels of water to flow from the fountain. Drinking this water can heal your HP or your MP, or eventually, once you've unlocked the fountain's gold water, both. A sippy from the Golden River may not sound significant, but when you have a sippy in a flask, everything changes. Flasks, which are in short supply, can carry the water of your choosing. This is a big deal in the beginning when you only have 2 flasks and you have to decide between health and mana. Later on, you'll have many more flasks, and the gold potion is a catch-all aid. In any case, what makes the flasks stand out is that they're both a limited and a renewable resource. You can't carry very much, but you can always go back for more. When you're knee-deep in the dead, lost in some dungeon later in the game, you can't very well just quickly go grab more. Refilling your flasks is a big commitment. Knowing that you may run out of water is a powerful motivator to play well and avoid damage or risky scenarios whenever possible. A mistake allowance, if you will. I stole that line from YouTube sensation Joseph Anderson's Dark Souls analysis because flasks in Kingsfield 2 are basically the same thing as Estus in Dark Souls. Like the interconnected world, Estus is a mechanic that Dark Souls is lauded for. The perfect solution to balance player healing with intentional challenge in an open world. And like Kingsfield 2, Dark Souls 2 went on to disrupt that balance by including life gems. They're plentiful, they're cheap, they're effective healing items. It's harder to design scenarios when you don't know what kind of resources your player might have, and that's definitely a shortcoming in Kingsfield. I think that extra mistake allowances are fine. I just believe healing items outside of flasks should be more expensive and harder to come by. I mean, in a perfect world where this game doesn't have terrible bosses, that's what I would want. As it stands, okay, the infinite healing might actually be necessary in certain cases. It's a terrible pain to have to open up your inventory screen and individually select items when you need to use several of them in a row. Still, flasks are a terrific addition to Kingsfield 2. Between the game world being beautifully recycled, the moon gates providing a limited fast travel option, and the flasks representing a precious resource, Kingsfield 2 imparts value in things. Nothing feels disposable. Even equipment is worth appreciating. Different weapon types deal different varieties of damage. Many weapons are side grades or situationally helpful, as opposed to just being plainly better than the thing you've already got. Same with armor, or even earlier iterations of magic spells. So many items retain their value long after you pick them up, and I love that careful thriftiness. The last example of such an item is the rhombus keys. You'll find these throughout the game, tucked away in hidden corners or dropping from enemies. Certain doors can't be unlocked with a traditional key, instead they'll have a rhombus-shaped indent next to the door. Here you place a rhombus key and go through the door. It might seem fairly straightforward, but rhombus keys are actually integral mechanics in Kingsfield 2. I just like saying the word rhombus. Placing a rhombus key in a door, you'll lose it temporarily. Like the warp keys, they can be removed at any given time. You'll lose access to the door, but you can add the key back to your stockpile and use it on a different one. Some areas have branching routes with many locked rhombus doors, so you'll want to have a good supply. The purpose of rhombus doors is twofold. First of all, they act as a great little warning sign for players. When you see a rhombus door, the area beyond will almost always represent a challenge. Unlock the door if you dare. Secondly, they act as an additional element of puzzle solving, which is very welcome in Kingsfield 2. In fact, it's highly conducive to the game's world design. Most rhombus doors will require a key on either side you're coming from. You can put a key this way, but if you're coming from the other way, you'll also need to put a key in there. This means that even if you decide to swipe your key on the way out, you'll be sacrificing one to use the door. That is, unless you're shrewd about your warp gate usage. With well-placed warp points, you can actually recoup a lot of your spent keys. Warp into a closed-off area, nab what you've placed, and then use another gate to warp out. Of course, this requires you to know when you're done with an area and take some forethought, but the option is there. Rhombus keys add a depth that rewards the keen-eyed player and also gives experienced players more options for traversal. Now, as much as I respect the increasingly complex world design, it has its issues. It is very easy to get lost in Kingsfield 2, especially for new players. God help you if you don't have a map for that area. So much of the game looks identical. Kingsfield 1 didn't have the strongest variety in visual design, but at least you knew what floor you were on. When things are broken down into a level-based package, it's a little bit more manageable. Not to mention the game's flat areas are easier to navigate. Not so in the second game. You really can get hopelessly lost easily, well, at least I can. The gates are critical here. You'll be looking for some place you saw 12 hours ago but can't really remember the way to. That place had a locked door, I bet I have the right key by now. You'll have to try every path and warp back to a familiar gate when you lose your way. There are a few areas which really showcase the sequel's improved sense of scale and environmental variety. There are sunken caves full of treasure, haunted graveyards full of wells that lead God knows where, mining facilities that have you crossing canyons and finding more termites. The emphasis is on making things bigger as much as it's about connecting them. A large part of that is the presentation, which is a significant step up from Kingsfield 1 in a number of ways. First of all, they seem to have more of a handle on texture mapping, for the most part. Yeah, there are still seams and very obvious repeating photo textures all over the place, but they more closely resemble the materials they're trying to emulate. Cliff faces actually look like rocks at a distance. The termites have carved their lair out of wood, which really changes the feeling of that area. Even something as simple as doors look much better. The geometry of the environment is still very simple, although there are improvements made there as well. Cave ceilings appear jagged and rocky. Man-made pathways have more natural curvature to them. Relatively small details perhaps, but when a game looks like this, it is worth sweating the small stuff. Perhaps the most immediately noticeable visual improvement is that of the models, enemy models in particular. They look so much better. From the first man-eater you see, the improvements in both texture work and poly count are significant. The increased level of detail in character models is clear. Enemies have more points of movement, which makes them look more natural as they shuffle around, repositioning to get an attack in on you. Even their damage animations and feedback are just so much better, leading to a greater sense of impact when you hit them with your axe. In addition, enemies are now comprised of multiple textures mapped in the appropriate area of the model, as opposed to one solid texture around the entire character. Well, that's not fair. The last game did have these dummy thick lizards, but all the thick lizards in a Floridian 7-Eleven can compare to the vastness of the improvements made here. Faceless though they are, even the humans look a far sight better than those in the last game. That facelessness is kinda growing on me as I go through these games. Even with all of the graphical boosts, what really matters in Kingsfield is the atmosphere, and I'm pleased to say that this game is swimming in it. It's not a continuation of Kingsfield 1's atmosphere so much as it's a distinct vibe that runs through the game. The previous game, to put it simply, had a very dark atmosphere. There was an awareness that you were alone in this haunted cemetery, going lower and lower and lower. You can't leave, you can only go deeper into the nightmare. Outside the walls of the cemetery, you're surrounded by stone and earth. It was suffocating. Kingsfield 2 isn't like that. Well, it is at times. You will be delving into some underground dungeons and they carry a weight to them. But for the most part, this isn't the feeling that characterizes the game for me. Arriving to Melanaut in its perpetual night, having the water below you, the stars above you, and the island in full view really informs the tone of the game immediately. It's lonely, it is dark, but there's less a feeling of claustrophobia and more a feeling of sorrow. Knowing the history of Melanaut and the adversity we're sure to face definitely enhances this. You don't feel crushed under the weight of your task, but forlorn in your surroundings. You have freedom, and you can come up for fresh air whenever you want, but you can't escape this place and its sad history. It's a history that surrounds you. The people you meet aren't safe, with the townsfolk disappearing, and a haunted graveyard literal steps from the village entrance. Not even this guy, cranking one out in a cave, can abate the hopelessness for long. The atmosphere here is incredibly unique. It's less dungeon crawler and more Kingsfield. I don't know how else to describe it. The skyboxes in this game are worth their own special mention. There's always something so vast and mysterious about that night sky. One side of the central village is covered in perpetual darkness, while just a short jaunt away, the other gets to experience daylight. In fact, you can see the surrounding island landmass. It doesn't make any sense, and that's what makes it great. I don't think it's intentional. Nishida wanted to include a day and night cycle, but the team ran out of time. Personally, I like it better like this. It adds an element of mystery and uncanniness, like the puzzle pieces of Melanaut just don't quite fit together. In a land where light and dark perpetually battle with each other, it suits the game to a T. Unfortunately, nothing in this world is free, and that includes beautiful textures like these. Kingsfield 2's performance is its own battle between light and dark. Seath wants you to play the game at 30 frames per second, while Gyra is trying to show you a Kingsfield 2 PowerPoint. This tug of war results in what can only be called the worst of both worlds. When there's not much going on, the game runs very smoothly, sometimes a little too smoothly. Animations tied to the frame rate run much faster. Enemies can make decisions more quickly. A pendulum blade trap becomes the world's deadliest metronome. Suddenly, your brain, full of molasses after playing 40 hours of Kingsfield, has to perform with lucid accuracy. However, if there's a wide open space or several enemies on screen, things slow to a crawl, worse than the previous game by quite a bit. From simply bit off a little more than they could chew. The yo-yo between higher frame rates and lower frame rates is often nauseating. Perhaps it was worth waiting the 18 extra months, as the PAL version is locked at a lower frame rate. It certainly doesn't solve the game's problems, but it's a good alternative. Frame rate is an interesting thing. I'll find myself adapting to a bad frame rate as long as it's consistent and the game doesn't demand much of my fine motor skills. It's a much harder pill to swallow when you can't get used to it. Kingsfield 2's frame rate is like a box of those seashell chocolates. You never know which one you're gonna get, but it is guaranteed to suck ass. I find that the music of these games plays a very important role in the experience, and Kingsfield 2 doesn't disappoint there. More so than the graphics, the music here is a continuation of King's Field 1. Many of the same synthesized instruments and choral effects are used. Those vocals in particular have a really unnatural quality that's somewhere between silly and haunting. Those things are closer together than you might think. You'll be hearing one tune in particular throughout the entire game. It plays when you're walking nearby the village, and it's a great track. The plodding beat just fills you with determination, and there's a hilariously evil organ reminding you of what you're up against. The only big difference I can think to talk about is how understated the music is in comparison to the last game. You don't compose a song with a synthesized slap bass in hopes that nobody notices. You want everyone to notice. Most of the tunes in this game are far more content to sit in the background, gently providing vibes and signaling to you when you're transitioning between areas. That changes in select cases where you're in more intense areas, but for the most part it just creates an ambience of evil that never lets up. The song that plays right in the beginning as you wash up on the shore is one of my personal favorites. I think it suits the game in ways that go beyond words. If you've played it, you know that this is King's Field's unofficial anthem. Harpsichords and King's Field go together like trombones and demon souls. Nothing would please me more than to talk about the game's voice acting, but of course, it doesn't have any. I didn't expect it to. Well, actually, when I heard the opening crawl being read, I did have some faint hope.
A mysterious darkness conquered the island of Marinette. There was either a god or a demon who controlled the island, and no one tried to go there.
From has always been good at picking unconventional voice talent. I love this Maronaut ASMR. Even without voice acting, I love his little wiener. I'm gonna call him Dweezil. Come Dweezil, it's time for an adventure. Put your boots on, we're going on an adventure now. Alright, fuck it. Let's visit Rand Ferrer. What are these names? Oh, Rand, it's been a minute. Glad to see the wife is doing well. Cliff lore. Well, if there's any developer I trust to write the most enthralling and intricate Cliff lore I've ever heard, it'd be FromSoftware. He is okay now, but I have to keep my eyes on him. You have not got any eyes to keep on him, ma'am. A lot of NPCs dole out little bits of lore, personal stories. It's not entirely unlike the characters of Demons and Dark Souls. You'll meet a descendant of the High Elves at one point, which is a fantastic moment in the game. You chat with her for a bit, head into her home, take a look around, and then... Ooh, spooky. The first game was full of illusory walls and traps, and that legacy lives on. This time, instead of simply being able to pass through a wall, you actually have to interact with it and wait for the wall to open up. This makes secret hunting even more awful than it was before. In the first game, you could butt your head up against the wall and charge at it. In King's Field 2, you have to run around like Doom Guy slapping the interact button at any suspicious wall, and sometimes at walls that aren't really that suspicious. It might seem like a microscopic point to zone in on, but it's a pretty major part of the game. So much equipment and even spells are gate-kept by secret walls. When your frame rate is tanked, you can't even be sure that your input has been read, so you have to press the X button like 3 times at every wall section just for assurance. Thankfully, phantom rods make their return, and they're more plentiful than ever. It's just as well given that, in terms of surface area, King's Field 2 is about 3 times as large as its predecessor, so said From. In general, only a few dungeons in the game have any kind of thematic significance. This is largely thanks to how naturally each area fits into the world. It harkens back to From's earlier statement about organic design. Real conversations, no tutorials, what logically follows is a world that isn't arbitrarily separated into levels. Nishida insisted upon the simulation of real-world environments, which Hidetaka Miyazaki would eventually incorporate into his games. There are some defined areas, and understanding the game's backstory makes their discovery more meaningful. One such area is King Harvine's castle, which was hastily abandoned if you remember the intro. Now it's full of reanimated knights, skeletons, so many goddamn skeletons, and these horrifying faces that spit at you. There's also these jackasses who just wander on up to the spiky ball. Never interrupt your enemy when they're about to make a mistake. Down here you can also find Dweezil. Say, that's a beautiful pair of boots. It'd be a shame if someone moved you out of the way half an inch at a time for the next 15 minutes to reach them. Wow, I can't believe it worked. Though this chest makes me think that the game intends for you to be here. These are the canonical events of Melonot Island. Like its predecessor, much of the exploration in this game is entirely optional. Many expansive and confusing areas will lead only to treasure that aids you in your quest. Still, unless you're using speedrun strategies, good gear and magic is arguably as necessary to anything that is actually necessary. Pleased to announce that instead of renaming the Flamberge, From has doubled down and simply decided to remodel the flame sword to actually be made of fire now. It's a degree of stubbornness that I can relate to, used to relate to. In addition to the standard equipment, there's plenty of magical items and accessories with varying effects. Sadly, this isn't Dark Souls, so their descriptions don't contain the entire history of Verdite. In order to find out what something does, you have to take it back to the fortune teller, who's located near the village. I suppose this helps enhance the feeling of mystery. Not knowing what a magic item does can make you sweat and wonder if you're subtly being cursed somehow. The answer to that is almost definitely yes. Still, I don't really feel like the fortune teller is a necessary addition. Why not just tell me what the item does? Well, far be it from me to request that Kingsfield treats the player humanely. Perhaps something like an identifying scroll would have been a happy medium. There are many items in this game, so if you don't want to fly blind, you'll be coming back here a lot. Or looking it up on the internet and hoping to stumble across some GeoCities website that tells you what every item does. In any case, once you're well equipped, you've stumbled your way through many dark passages and have the requisite items, you can enter the end game. Like the last game, many of these excursions can be totally circumvented if you know where you're going, or if you feel like you just don't need the extra swag. The thing is that levels and equipment are more important here than ever. The bosses represent a hard proving ground, more of one's HP than one's skill, and the only way to gain the former is to fight a lot of skeletons. Infinitely respawning skeletons. Aside from the rhombus keys, even the endgame is quite light on puzzles, unless you consider trying to find a door to be a puzzle. More than puzzles, the last few dungeons test your mettle with a variety of the game's most obnoxious enemies. Few are worse than these fucking faces. Just look at them, laughing at me as they cruise just out of smashing range. All these assholes crowding around, staring at me like I got games on my phone. In a game that's made for one-on-one combat and doesn't even really do that well, it's pretty brutal. Thankfully, you can find Seath's helmet, which does an unreasonably good job replenishing your health over time. This thing should work about half as quickly as it does. As you make your way to the end, you find that things aren't so cut and dry as you thought. It's not so much Seath good and Gyra bad. Rather, the light that Seath casts is the shadow that is Gyra. They battle but can't exist without each other. They've even used their worshippers as avatars in this senseless feud. The Sword of Moonlight was created by Gyra for human or elven use. Necron, the demon inhabiting the island, was once a normal person who's been corrupted by Gyra's magic. Now he toils beneath the island in his laboratory, powered by the crystals, creating monsters for Gyra's army. This is another great instance of environmental storytelling. You can only glean information from what's happening in front of you. It's a little bit of science fiction injected into Kingsfield. I also appreciate some in-universe context as to why there are monsters running around the island. The presence of evil itself would have probably been a sufficient explanation, but this is far more interesting. After completing a 4-boss gauntlet with a bunch of enemies that are too big to effectively fight you, we do battle with Necron. His sister has come to the island in search of him, and knowing his backstory makes things even more tragic. But battle we must, and he... Where are you going? Is he waiting for a high five to be reciprocated? Wow, that is the best squatting form I have ever seen, while wearing armor no less. Oh, okay, he has not forgotten about that high five. Sorry to leave you hanging, brother, but I had to do it to you. Now before I go any further, I've got to mention something quickly. I expected more poison swamps in this game, and I'm impressed by the developer's restraint. Miyazaki loves poison swamps, like, he loves poison swamps. While talking about all of the poison swamps in Elden Ring, Miyazaki said, and I quote, "I can't help myself." I'm not a fan of poison swamps. I don't think a lot of people are fans of poison swamps. You move very slowly, the enemies inexplicably are unaffected by the sludge, and of course, you get poisoned. When you're poisoned, you can't really fight effectively because you have to unpoison yourself, but you can't really unpoison yourself because you have to fight. Anyway, all that to say, I would still take a poison swamp any day over a teleporter cube maze. A teleporter cube maze is, to me, sort of the ultimate fuck you. Teleporter mazes are among the lowest of the low in terms of level types, and transparent cubes are among the lowest of the low in terms of types of walls and floors. The game had built up so much goodwill over the past couple of hours, but here, it's over. I'm condemned to wander the teleporter cube maze for all eternity. Later that day, I finished the teleporter cube maze and arrived at the final boss. In the interest of not complaining about two separate entities, I'll just consider this an extension of the teleporter cube maze. When you die to the final boss, you get to do the teleporter cube maze again. So if you think about it from a cube half full perspective, the worse you are at fighting the boss, the better you get at doing the teleporter cube maze. The final boss here is Gaira in dragon form, and the whole affair is marginally better than the first game's final boss. He stands stock still, but has a wide variety of moves. It works a little better than most bosses because, on top of being able to bait out specific attacks, he has tells that you'll learn over time. It's not too difficult to avoid his stronger attacks, although he's got these annoying orbs that float around the arena doing chip damage. You can dispatch them with spells or your bow, but Gaira starts using really strong projectiles when you wander around. The damage they do is negligible enough that your huge-ass stockpile of healing items should be enough to carry you through. Since magic doesn't work on him, the fight takes a long time. You'll be smacking this thing in the head or neck or nothing 50% of the time because the hitbox is just wherever the game wants it to be, but eventually Gaira will fall. He becomes very tiny and floats away in an orb. Alexander grasps the Moonlight Sword. The island's curse is broken as Seath and Gaira disappear from Melonot. The Moonlight Sword's return ensures that Verdite will live happily ever after. Or will it? In case it's not obvious, my respect for Kingsfield 2 is monumental. It is an incredibly, surprisingly forward-thinking game. Many of the improved mechanics are treated as precious, reusable elements rather than disposable additions. Sweeping changes, particularly to the world design, alter the experience in a lot of ways, yet they're implemented with a subtlety that's hard to appreciate when you've been conditioned by the 30 years of games since. It's a game with many problems, ambition that was perhaps too great for its own good. Bosses don't really work. They're brutal shit tests designed to empty your coffers of healing items and you of patience. Despite some noticeable improvements to melee, magic, and ranged battling, there's still issues with combat, some perhaps fundamental to this kind of game, the way that they're making it. The game has wonderfully creative level design, and the whole world feels like an extension of itself, which is both a blessing and a curse. You never know if you're progressing, wandering around in the dark, or some combination of both. They succeeded in making a world more organic than any dungeon crawler up to that point. They just needed more time and resources to make it feel less homogeneous, I think. Kingsfield 2 is a non-linear cult classic piece of history. It, even more so than its predecessor, excels in its atmosphere, tone, and ambience. It presents you with agency that you may not be prepared for, and it will send you through the gauntlet, and you will cry, but you will come out the other side glad to have experienced it. This game and the people behind it deserve recognition for quietly planting a seed that would change the action RPG genre. Without this game, there's no Dark Souls. On a personal level, without Dark Souls, I never find Matthew Matosis and Joseph Anderson's analyses. I never become interested in doing this, and I never bloviate about Kingsfield 2 to you here on YouTube. I suppose that's history for you, a bunch of dumb luck that results in the here and now. Well, here's my opinion on Kingsfield 2. You should play it now. Immediately following Kingsfield 2's release, Nishida began penning the scenario for Kingsfield 3, or Kingsfield 2 as it would be known in the West. The increased emphasis on dialogue, lore, and environmental storytelling put some pressure on the team to make something bigger, more epic, and bombastic. From had accrued much technical knowledge during the production of Kingsfield 1 and 2. This allowed them to further beautify what would become Kingsfield 3. The team didn't take to the improved visuals. They felt that by the second game, Kingsfield had an atmosphere all its own, an identity. This was partially the result of its short draw distance, dim lighting, and otherwise lo-fi graphics. Nishida advised the art designer, create the impression of a grim atmosphere, lonely to the point of tears. This ethos, this focus on apocalyptic fantasy, became a FromSoftware trademark. Born from technical limitations, they've become very good at portraying this low fantasy plagued by darkness. In June 1996, FromSoftware released a promotional disc. On it was effectively a demo for their next game called Kingsfield 3 Pilot Style. Scant information on this demo exists, but supposedly only 8 individuals at the 1996 Tokyo Game Show were given a copy by From. I would take that with a grain of salt since it's only a rumor, but in any case, years later, somebody would upload a copy onto the internet. From there, John Osborne, the man, the myth, the legend, would translate it into English. Thanks again, John. It's just as well too because this is much more than a simple demo. Pilot Style fits in between Kingsfield 2 and 3 as a miniature story, showing what happened leading up to the third game. It seems that evil has returned to Verdite. You play as the warrior Silviera, searching for what else but the Sword of Moonlight. While it's only an hour long, you get a strong sense for the advancements made in Kingsfield 3, which we'll talk about in greater depth shortly. The performance in the demo is, like Kingsfield 2, all over the damn place. They put these balls in the most unstable places, I swear. The demo ends with a boss fight, which is really more of a regular fight with a strong enemy, and Silviera finding the broken Moonlight Sword at like 100 frames per second, my god. He remembers words spoken to him by the king. Verdite's savior will come soon. You must protect the broken holy sword and give it to him, no doubt foreshadowing the adventures to come. On June 96th? That's a crazy long month to wait just for one game. Pilot Style was a pretty progressive idea, although it's odd that just a few people were given a copy of it, supposedly. My guess is that the team developed this as a prototype or a scrapped idea for the main game and just found a way to repurpose it. It's a smart repurposing though, and this idea of creating extraneous media to give games greater context would become more popular over time. Eventually, Kingsfield 3 did release proper in Japan and internationally. Once again, From pulled it off in less than a year after their previous game. This time it was more like 11 months though, which is still wild, but just a little bit more reasonable. The first Kingsfield game had a staff of only 7 active employees. By now, FromSoftware had grown. They had 30 developers in 1998, so it's reasonable to assume 15 to 20 in 96. In fact, that might be a liberal estimate. Nishida said in an interview, "We'll probably grow a little larger, but not much." Okay, that's rich. The first thing you'll notice booting up Kingsfield 3 is that they got a brand new voice actor to do the intro.
No one could explain the fall of the king. 15 years ago, Alfred had slain the dice-festering evil and had risen triumphant as the new king.
He is the best. I love hearing him do these reads. Verdite's current king, the once beloved Jean Alfred, has gone mad. Where once he had slain evil, it now festers within him. He destroyed the Moonlight Sword, the symbol of hope for Verdite's people. Alexander, the protagonist from the previous game, imbued upon 4 people magical powers in order to protect the kingdom. I don't necessarily know how he did it, let's just assume the Moonlight Sword gave him some kind of power in the previous game. Alexander sacrifices himself to seal the castle in holy magic, and magically sends the king's young son, Lyle, a warning of the events to come. 10 years later, Lyle is strong and wise enough to understand the message sent to him. He returns to the lost kingdom of Verdite.
For 10 years, Lyle carried the burden of being prince to a damned kingdom. Now old enough to understand the message etched in his mind forever, it's time he faced his destiny.
Good lord, man, tone it down a notch. Lyle has spent 10 years in the care of Leon, high elf and expert swordsmith. He gifts Lyle a sword called the Excelictor, which is probably the coolest weapon name I've heard across the entire series, and sends Lyle on his way. That's a lot more stuff and things than Kingsfield 1. I do like how they tie the different games together though. That's the benefit of assuming the player has already been through the previous game, as opposed to Kingsfield 2 where they were essentially starting with a fresh slate. The first thing I'll say, because it's the first thing I noted, is that the game is locked at 17 frames per second. If I told you that before talking about any of the other games, you probably would have been shocked and appalled. But now, in light of the alternative, it's actually a huge relief. See, Kingsfield 3 ups the graphical detail to a significant degree. Whereas Kingsfield 1 used 200 to 300 polygons per model, Kingsfield 3 uses upward of 1500. In Todd Howard terms, that's 5 times the detail. The enemy models, NPC models, and the item models are all a massive step up in terms of visual fidelity. It's not just that, the texture size has been improved greatly and there are just more textures in general. Finally, perhaps the most impressive thing is that environmental geometry is much more complex than the previous game. There are rolling hills and slopes, well, relatively speaking. Walls come to curvatures, giving a more natural and organic sense of coherence to the outdoor environments. Speaking of those environments, they are far more expansive than anything we saw in Kingsfield 2. From the beginning, the team wanted to do more with these outdoor sections, and they definitely followed through with those plans in Kingsfield 3. Because of these expansive outdoor sections and improved visuals, the game without its limiter was even less stable than Kingsfield 2. The decision was made to limit the frame rate, and it was a wise one indeed. One other sacrifice the game makes is its sprite-based trees, which don't look great, but it's hardly a big deal in light of the changes. I mean, the man-eaters have never looked better. Damn, what a way we've come. Say, I wonder if there's a secret door down here. Okay, so that's how it's gonna be, is it? One thing the team was worried about in development was providing player direction in open environments. It's hard enough to stay on the rails when the game world is providing you pathways to go down. Having no guardrails is another kettle of fish entirely. With this in mind, From saw their limited rendering range as a tool rather than an impediment. Darkness obscures large swaths of the outdoor sections. When you enter a new area, you'll often see obvious pathways and gates acting as breadcrumb trails. Treasure and other fucking delights await those brave enough to go off the beaten path. But for the most part, you are given indication of the quote-unquote intended way to go. There are some 3D objects like Verdite Castle that render regardless of its distance to the player, helping give you a sense of direction and scale. It all works together as a solid solution for what would have been a real problem back in 1996. People who started playing Daggerfall that year are still walking to Gothway Gardens as we speak. I'm sure it'll be over the next hill. Don't give up. If you do wander around the opening area, you'll find a lot of treasure chests and other various sundries that can't be accessed yet, so start taking mental notes, as you'll surely be back many times. While the Excelictor looks very cool and has an extremely badass name, it's actually outclassed by pretty much any weapon you find in the first few minutes of the game. That's because the sword levels up alongside you. It'll become more powerful as you gain experience. It also doesn't matter whether you're actively using it, so feel free to just throw it in your inventory and come back later to see how it's doing. The swordplay and general combat rhythm of this game iterates on Kingsfield 2 in some good ways, and a few I'm not so sure about. It essentially works the same way, so there's no reason to go over another basic combat explanation. Damage types make a much more significant difference in this game, with high crush damage being great against enemies like skeletons, or holy damage being effective against the undead, like skeletons. You know, now that I think about it, why do skeletons represent such a threat? Shouldn't they just fall apart with the smallest application of force? You'd think so, but no, especially not in Kingsfield 3. The threshold required to make enemies flinch or interrupt their attacks seems to be much higher in this entry. I don't like that. The hit feedback in the second game was a big improvement over the first, but here it feels worse than that. Enemies often don't flinch at all. There are some enemies like these mushroom things where avoiding damage is often entirely contingent on making them flinch, but without the required power level, they just don't. It makes you feel weak and ineffective. As a matter of fact, I spent a lot of time wondering if I was even making contact with the enemy at all. This was never a problem before in the series, even in the first game, so I find the change very odd. It's almost a prototypical example of Dark Souls' stagger system, but the lack of feedback makes it tough to contend with. On the upside, enemy behaviors have seen an upgrade from King's Field 2. Movement speed hasn't changed, but combat feels slower and more deliberate than ever. Enemies will actively stop you from getting the drop on them, making you unable to circle strafe many of the humanoid foes. Spamming attacks won't always work. Enemies have contingency plans, like getting out of dodge and raising a shield when you swing. You actually have to move back and forth quickly, tricking the enemy and coming from the other direction. The focus on lunges and distance closing moves is also heightened. This makes it more important than ever to understand enemy behaviors. Your brain can't really turn off, you've always got to think about what weapon you're using and how you're using it. Once you know you're strong enough and have the right damage type, you can more boldly step up to enemies to stagger them. Thankfully, the game now allows you to map consumable items to the select button. You better believe the minute I figured that out, I slapped medicinal herbs on that slot and kept them there till the bitter end. I'm not even kidding when I say this small change probably saves you an hour of menu usage downtime over the course of the game. There's also a menu option which allows you to store and retrieve items and equipment you aren't using, which is awesome. All in all, this game represents the single biggest improvement in combat up to this point. It only adds mechanical complexity, it doesn't remove anything, although some things remain or are altered to become more frustrating. The opening area is called Quist Village. Unsurprisingly, it has a shop where you can buy and sell things. New to the series is the Inns. Here you can pay a nominal fee to restore your health and MP anytime. There's also a save point in here, which, like the other games, are in rather short supply. Outside of the initial learning curve, you likely won't be visiting inns often, but they do add to the game's overall flavor of journey and adventure. Dying in the Kingsfield games will force you to reload unless you have a dragon crystal. These rare items will instantly bring you back to full health when used, but if you have one on your person, you'll respawn in a hidden area of Quist Village with all of your stuff. It's kind of a hit or miss mechanic. 9 times out of 10, it's just more efficient to reload your last save. I do like the idea of the trade-off with dragon crystals. Reminds me of Dark Souls Humanity, a useful item you don't want to waste, but also one that restores your health in a pinch. Sometimes it's worth using just to avoid death. Attached to the opening area is the first real dangerous zone, the ancient battlefield, inhabited by all manner of ghouls and bellsprouts. There's a woman here who asks you to help lay her dead son's spirit to rest. It's a bit out of the way, and for this early in the game, it's a dangerous activity. It's entirely optional. In fact, there are a number of optional quests you can complete throughout Kingsfield 3. The game wears its increased ambition on its sleeve. Some NPCs know who you are, some don't. Some have hopes that you'll return things to their former glory, and some write you off as the cursed spawn of that asshole in the castle. Was that a Matei joke? Hearing the old woman wistfully recall memories of her childhood home is sad. Afterwards, she tells Lyle that she considers him family. This woman's dialogue, along with that of other NPCs, really sells the horrifying state of Verdite. Things feel dire. Also, the game has a glossary where you can peruse the conversations you've already had. It's a great way to catch up if you just feel lost or if a character requested something you can't remember. Completing her assignments, you'll be rewarded with a map of Verdite, as well as your first magic spell. In this game, spells of each elemental school are initially granted via these sigils on the ground. Along with the spell, you'll also receive a telepathic message from a figure associated with that element. After initially learning that school, the corresponding crystals will boost your individual schools of magic, and you can learn more spells by raising their stats. It's a good system, but if you start using crystals before having learned that magic, you'll just waste them. It's entirely possible you'll do this unknowingly. From there, you'll enter a far more dungeony zone. You'll find not 1, not 2, but 3 distinct varieties of skeleton, including these boys that try to tickle you with their riblets. This area, the barracks, feels the most like a Kingsfield 1 zone since Kingsfield 1. It's designed very horizontally, but there are a lot of secret doors and areas that aren't accessible yet. There's much more by way of scenery in Kingsfield 3 though. Props like tables, shelves, chairs populate areas to make them feel lived in, and different areas will use different models for the same object, which is a nice touch. Kingsfield 3 allows you to examine non-magical items for a description, which is a massive help. This is the master key for most of the treasure chests. Most of the time, the key opens the treasure chests. The key opens fucking like 4 of the 900 chests in this game. Don't fall for its lies. The game also introduces the ability to use your bow to operate distant switches, and although this mechanic is seldom used, it is a treat to uncover it for the first time. There's a great deal more environmental interactivity in this game that we'll cover shortly. The fountains and flasks make a comeback as well. Rather than having you manually adding types of water over time, different areas will have preset fountains that you can bottle water from for later. It's not as creatively implemented, and for various reasons it doesn't work as well, but it's still a good system. The barracks directly connect to another dungeon area called the Forest of Vard. This means that at any point you need to replenish healing items, you have to go for a long walk through the forest, through the barracks, through the ancient battlefield, back to the store. Considering this is the beginning of the game, it's likely you'll need to make this pilgrimage at least once. The Forest of Vard, however, is an interesting area because it introduces you to one of the core differences between Kingsfield 3 and every other game in the series. You are given a key which can slot into these crests around the area. Doing so will cause giant tree stumps to rearrange themselves. Some will go away, allowing you access to an area, and some will appear, barring you from other areas. Kingsfield 3's dungeons often contain structured puzzles. Rarely are they complex, but their presence adds a lot to the game for me. In general, there are 2 major components to a Kingsfield game. The first is exploration, which could include a lot of different things. Mapping out an area, finding secret doors, speaking to NPCs, and just walking around. The bulk of your time is spent exploring. The second component is combat, which is just what it sounds like. Kingsfield excels at the former, but not so much in the latter, meaning, objectively speaking, there's not much to these games. Of course, a game like this is an experiential thing, like I said, more than the sum of its parts, but there's room for improvement. Adding puzzles to the dungeons takes advantage of that room in a really non-intrusive way. The puzzles are simple enough to be a natural extension of the existing gameplay, and just complicated enough to add some much-needed variety. There's the Temple of Wind, for instance, a dark and eerie dungeon made up of symmetrical branching paths. In order to reach the end, you'll have to find and light every torch in the dungeon. Not only a simple puzzle with some environmental interactivity, but a subtle nudge to the player that they might have missed learning a spell earlier. After all, you need to cast Fireball to light the torches. Lake Noel is dotted with small islands that can only be reached via different magical bridges. In order to activate them, you have to spin this color wheel to their corresponding color, causing some bridges to appear and others to vanish. In case you're wondering, yes, being colorblind was a problem for me at this part. To use the wheel, you have to give the woman guarding it increasingly hard to come by items, so you can't really wantonly try your luck. You have to carefully study the bridges that can be raised and pick colors in the most efficient way possible. Exploration is optional for much of the map, but who knows what treasures await ye. By the time you arrive in the game's second town, Relugo Village, it's clear that there's another big structural pivot. The way that the world fits together is entirely different than the previous games. Kingsfield 1 had 5 dungeon levels, Kingsfield 2 had an intertwined world comprised of several different environments. Kingsfield 3 once again features something akin to levels but connected to each other via choke points located in each area. The shortcuts and routes back to previous areas have been replaced with a much simpler and more traditional structure. Let's discuss what's bad about this first. The most obvious arrow through the proverbial heart is that this world structure sacrifices what made Kingsfield 2 so unique. That excitement you feel arriving to a prior area in an unexpected way is severely diminished. It's not entirely gone because certain areas do contain routes back to previous ones, but they're simple pathways and more a matter of expectation over time. Part of the fun involved in navigating Kingsfield 2 is constantly making mental calculations, trying to remember all of the spidery pathways that might lead to your goal, and striving for efficiency while choosing the best ones. Well, that was part of the fun for me anyway. Some people might hate this and welcome a more linear format. I think in either case we can agree that the intentionally designed organic world of the second game did make it special, a bold and unique choice in level design. Kingsfield 3 in comparison is far more traditional. I would actually liken this change to that which was Dark Souls to Dark Souls 2. That sequel gets a lot of shit, and a lot of it is warranted, and some of it isn't. Regardless, one of the things people take issue with is that Dark Souls 2 abandoned Dark Souls' iconic world design. Structurally, Dark Souls 2 and Kingsfield 3 have a lot in common. Each game has areas, or levels, that outstretch to one or more levels, and then those outstretch to one or more levels, and then eventually you reach the end of a branch and you're forced to backtrack to an earlier point and head down a different set of branches. Here's a rough map of the games and the way that levels flow into each other. Hopefully you can see what I mean. There's a parallel here. It's less organic and arguably results in a more repetitive, or at least less replayable experience. The upside to this is that levels can be designed with an intended flow. If you know where the player is going and don't have to worry about where they're coming from, it's much easier to curate enemy placements, item drops, and that kind of thing. In Kingsfield's case, having this clear delineation between borders also greatly helps the level variety, both visual design and the mechanical structure of these areas. Some are more open, exploratory, and horizontal, and others are more labyrinthian and vertical. You can have an open prairie built on the precept of exploration, you can have a cave full of linear hallways full of combat challenges, or a more vertical dungeon that confuses you as you try to navigate it. Kingsfield 2 didn't have this kind of flexibility. As intelligently designed as that game is, I do prefer Kingsfield 3's take on things. I wish it were designed more often with verticality in mind, but still, I prefer having this large variety of different areas. I always looked forward to passing through a dungeon and seeing what would come next. The game itself also isn't linear, not by a long shot. Most of these dungeons immediately assail you with the classic Kingsfield confusion. They're full of different hallways, secret doors, and branching paths. Most of the dungeons will actually lead to at least 2 different areas as well, so you still have to be conscious about heading in the quote-unquote right direction. You're never funneled, necessarily. Also, something incredibly impressive about Kingsfield 2 and 3 is the lack of loading screens. I don't mean that the games don't have many loading screens, I mean that outside of fast traveling, the games don't have loading screens. Transitions between areas are totally seamless, which heightens the immersion and makes the game so much more enjoyable to just play. It's also a startling technical achievement for a disc-based game in 1996 and something that's not often discussed when people talk about Kingsfield. I can understand why. After all, if something isn't in a game, why would you notice or think about it? The lack of breaks in the world and interruptions is really critical in establishing the flow of these games. Thanks to the snail's pace your character moves at, data can be actively streamed from the game disk as opposed to having to be loaded in chunks. Yet another example of a technical restraint being turned into something practical. In order to contend with the many complex areas in the game, Kingsfield 3 gives you one of, if not the, most helpful item in the entire series, the Pixies map. This is a dungeon auto map. It begins as a blank sheet of paper in each area, but as you explore, it'll fill in and give you a good idea of the pathways you've already been to or might have missed. It's downright necessary given some of the complexity of the game's later dungeons, and something that would have been nice to have in any of the Kingsfield games. The second most useful item in the entire series, slightly more sarcastically, is the Fujin boots. Something I didn't mention in previous sections of the video is that you can sprint by holding down the interact button while moving. This is true for all games but the first. It's mostly a luxury in Kingsfield 2, but in the third game it becomes critically important to your strategy, namely, it allows you to dodge certain enemy attacks and traps. The problem with that sprinting is that it drains your stamina and magic gauge, and the delay before they refill can feel like an eternity. The Fujin boots altogether eliminate that time period. I slapped these fuckers on and didn't peel them off till Lyle was at home with his wife and kids, watching the game and drinking a Miller Lite. There are certain points where sprinting is necessary, small gaps that can only be crossed while sprinting for instance. There's this narrow cliff in Relugo village that can't be walked across. How the fuck did it spit me out like that? It's like the smallest incline I've ever seen. Ah well, nothing that several attempts can't fix. This brings to mind a minor complaint I have. Since dying, loading, reloading, and trying again is such a laborious task, you often feel punished for experimenting. This is less of an issue if you use save states generously, but more obvious tells for death traps would have been appreciated. Once the game is sure you can kill mushrooms and skeletons, it starts throwing heftier combat challenges at you. The Temple of Wind, for instance, has these fellas who move quickly and toss wind magic at you. Along with that, there's these salamander guys whose projectiles I'm just convinced are unavoidable. Thankfully, the game doesn't really have bosses, other than in very select moments. This is a good thing. It lets you sit back and enjoy the game's ambience without having to worry about saddling yourself with healing items. Speaking of ambience, this game's got it in spades, which should not be a surprise anymore. With the visuals getting better and the tone becoming intentionally darker, the game almost feels like one of those modern indie games that's made to look like a PS1 game, but it's the genuine article. If you were going to experience any one Kingsfield game just for the sake of historical curiosity, I would probably recommend this one. There's such an awesome variety of moods this game gives you. I get a very strong case of secondhand nostalgia just playing it. I almost wish I'd played it as a child so that nostalgia could be firsthand, but man, this game is way too fucking scary for me to have played as a kid. I had to get my older brother to check our basement for re-deads before I'd go down till I was 24 years old. These faces on the walls alone would have given me nightmares back then. There's just such an intimidating presence to so many of the enemies in this game. In one dungeon, you've got to hunt down and find these golems. It's spooky enough to fight them with a low draw distance, you just don't know what's going to emerge from the fog. Then all of a sudden the game throws these black golems at you and they take 1 trillion hits and you're just white knuckling the controller trying not to get clobbered. The black golems drop a material called Prometheus. Later on, in an abandoned dwarven village, you can have the lone smithy build you pieces of armor out of Prometheus. It's cool to have the option, but there are a few issues with it. The dwarven village itself is largely inaccessible. You have to travel through a pretty long dungeon to get there, and the village itself is a dead end. There's no way to double back somewhere else. You have to take a long road trip and back every time you want to build something. Mind you, the Prometheus armor also takes time to build, so you've got to go kill several minutes until it's ready for you. The second big problem is that by the time you've got enough Prometheus to have most or all of the armor, you're in the end game where superior armor can be found. All in all, a nice little idea that doesn't work all that well here, but it will be expanded on in Kingsfield's future. The environmental storytelling is also vastly improved over the previous games. Without hearing about it, you begin to understand that there was some kind of a war between giants and another race, seemingly with the giants losing as their skeletons are scattered in ancient tombs. Sounds a little familiar. One of my favorite instances of this type of storytelling comes later in an area called the Fields of Ice. In order to progress, you'll need to find a switch hidden in a carved-out section of the mountain. This leads you to the Caves of Garan. On top of having the switch be deliberately hidden, the entrance to this area just screams, "Danger, don't go here." After the passage has been opened, you can come back later to find the entire area overrun, where once there were ice gargoyles roaming freely, lizard men and giants have taken control of the area, enemies that were trapped in the caves. It seems the new inhabitants slaughtered those gargoyles. Was the passage sealed to prevent this? Is there a grudge between these groups from ages past? Were the giants held prisoner? This area also seems to be a point of excavation for Prometheus metal. Perhaps some kind of conflict involving this resource took place. There are a lot of questions lending to this air of mystery, which is very prevalent in the third game. The elevated focus on storytelling also extends to the storytelling. There are characters with interesting things to say, actual arcs that characters go through. You meet an elf named Lynn, or re-meet rather, as Lyle and Lynn were actually childhood friends. She clearly has a crush on me. She clearly has a crush on Lyle, and it's nice to have some established character history, as well as a friendly face, because not everybody takes so kindly to Lyle. Throughout the game, you'll see Lynn in a few different places, having exhausted her dialogue. She recalls stories of Alexander, her best friend after Lyle left 10 years ago. He'd given her a ring and told her that if she ever wanted to see him again, to put the ring on and come to the Dragon's Spring. But Alexander, having sacrificed himself to seal the Mad King, is not alive any longer. Later, after much contemplation, Lynn leaves to look for her father, who went to the Caves of Garan to find Prometheus. You find her there, dead, with Alexander's ring. It's not Shakespeare, but you care a little less about just getting to the finish line and a little more about the people inhabiting Verdite. This increased emphasis on characters as well as the tragedy surrounding them is a result of Nishida's influence. His desire to tell more epic as well as more personal stories is on display without sacrificing any of that narrative minimalism that Kingsfield is known for. It's another clear and obvious influence present in the Souls games. Things don't usually work out for the people you meet because this isn't a fantasy world of abundance, hopes, and dreams. It's a world of decay, a world on its last legs where the only hope is some guy who falls off rocks and dies. But that same man also willingly jumps off rocks and lives, so perhaps hope does spring eternal. That is until you reach the Palace of Death. This place was Sense Fortress before Sense Fortress. I mean, my god, the tricks, the traps, the skeletons, the ghosts, the skeletons, the secret walls, the labyrinths, the skeletons, the skeletons. They don't take it easy on you in this game. Thankfully, with dungeons having more obvious entry points, you know when it's a good idea to prepare. As you unlock more areas, the game bestows upon you a mercy nearly on par with the Pixies map. I'm talking about the Icrius artifacts. From a narrative standpoint, you're supposed to collect these artifacts in order to enter the barrier surrounding Verdite Castle. In gameplay terms, these 3 artifacts will allow you to fast travel to the town associated with them. You'll still have to hoof it anywhere that isn't one of the game's 3 towns, at least until you combine the artifacts. After the Excelictor has reached its highest level and the Icrius items are collected, you can return to Leon, who asks you to wait for a little while. When you return, Leon will have disappeared, leaving in his place an upgraded Excelictor. The Excelictor, in true Excelictor fashion, isn't as good as the sword you can get nearby called the Triple Fang. The sword is actually in the other games as well, probably the least practical looking weapon ever made, except for Kingsfield 3, where it's basically just a normal cool sword. Anyway, aside from the sword, you'll also get an item called the Icrius Key. This lets you teleport to any fountain in the game. Since a fountain is strategically placed in almost every above-ground zone, this is incredibly helpful, if a bit of an inelegant solution to the game's traversal problems. In fact, Nishida was pretty busted up over having to sacrifice Kingsfield 2's style of level design. He wanted to implement more 3-dimensional winding verticality, but due to the graphical improvements and area sizes, it was simply impossible to have these 2 things exist alongside each other. Still, they were resourceful with what they had, and the Icrius Key makes a strong positive difference in your ability to explore. If you know what you're doing, it's possible to sequence break various aspects of Kingsfield 3. In fact, I accidentally skipped a quest this way. There are these items that unpetrify characters and enemies that have turned to stone. Sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? They're very expensive, but I wanted to make sure I wasn't caught with my pants down, so I spent all of my money on one right away. Later, you find a warrior named Veyrak encased in stone, so of course I used the item to save him. Then he starts talking about some lady named Tony I've never met, as if I'm supposed to know her. It turns out that you're supposed to talk to her first, and then she gives you one of these items in question. The moral of the story is this: don't try to be proactive, don't try to be smart, life will just screw you over. Nonetheless, it's cool that you can avoid some of these quests altogether if you know what you're doing. Using the Icrius Key is the only way to reach the Valley of the High Elves, which isn't nearly as whimsical a place as the name would have you believe. In fact, it's very depressing. The variation in elevation and geometry here really showcase how much more complex the 3rd game is on that front. This area, at least as it is now, would have been completely impossible to make in the previous games. You have to slot the Icrius Key into a pedestal in order to activate the teleporters here, which is an interesting trade-off. By this point, I used the key so much that not having it leaves me feeling a little naked. Yet you need to activate the teleporters to move around this area, so you have to leave the key behind, despite not knowing what awaits you. In order to explain the final few areas of the game, it's helpful to understand a bit more of the Kingsfield lore. We know of Seath and Gyra, the models for what would later become, well, Seath and Calamite in the Souls games, but we don't know much about their origin. The God of Gods created this world where the games take place, Volicia. It also created the 3 demigods, Seath, Gyra, and Volad. Seath and Gyra, much to God's chagrin, vie for dominance, while Volad attempts to maintain balance, as instructed. Icrius and Orladin, 2 wise elves, are able to commune with Volad through a world tree. Orladin would help build a maze around the tree in order to protect it so that only he and his disciples might commune with Volad. He was instructed to grant the power of Volad to the one who would slay Seath and Gyra. More questions than answers, I know, but the important thing is how the game ties itself into that lore. Within the Valley of the Elves, you find the entrance to the Temple of Orladin. It's easily one of my favorite dungeons in the game thanks to its unique design and, in retrospect, the weight associated with being here. The temple maze is full of traps and rooms that lead to nowhere. It's clearly designed to keep you out. In order to progress, you'll need to access doors with Orladin keys, fairly rare items that disappear after being used once. Sounds familiar. Orladin locks can be found elsewhere in the game, but they're most concentrated in this dungeon. There are a lot of new enemies as well, such as these grinning assholes who spit arrows at you and laugh at your misfortune. On a personal note, I have reoccurring dreams where I'm lost in a concrete basement that just keeps going lower and lower. I strongly associate this area with that dream. It's got a very strong, similar sense of energy to that dream. Finally, after many trials and tribulations, you come across a headless skeleton relaxing on his throne. Placing the skull causes the stairs of the room to rise in an FMV cutscene, which perhaps would have transitioned more subtly on a 16-inch CRT television. At last, you reach the tree, a crystalline growth through which Volad speaks to Lyle, imbuing him with knowledge of the world's origin. It's just as well that this area is called the Place of the Beginning. The Souls games in their ilk have always excelled at spectacle. You're fed knowledge of places and people who have phased in and out of legend so many times that even people in the world itself don't know if they exist anymore. Every once in a while, the game will give you first-hand knowledge of their existence, and it's almost always a wow moment. This thing you've heard about for so long is right there in front of you, and it's either just as spectacular as you imagined, or perhaps not what you expected at all. The Place of the Beginning may not be flashy, the lore might be a bit obtuse, but this is the first time in Kingsfield that I felt as if I were somewhere significant. You're granted Icrius's armor, a fitting reward for a hero now blessed by prophecy. After finding the broken Moonlight Sword, we're almost ready to storm the castle and confront the Mad King, but there's a few more interesting things to talk about before then. Well, it turns out that Alexander wasn't telling a lie. If you bring the ring he'd gifted Lynn to the Dragon Spring, why does that sentence sound like a UK freestyle rap? Anyway, with the ring in hand, Alexander appears and teaches you how to use sword magic. As before, certain weapons can fire projectiles that do stupid damage to both you and the enemies, so look out. Further along in the courtyard, you'll find a sigil on the ground. Stepping into it will warp you to level 1 of the Royal Cemetery. Entering here answers an age-old question of mine. Yes, you can be nostalgic over a game you played for the first time, like a month ago. It's a fantastic revisit. I can't imagine the hype levels a longtime Kingsfield fan would have felt back in 1996. All of the hours spent in these dungeons, hearing about the lore, wondering if you'd ever get to explore Verdite, and well, here it is. Of course, less so for the American fans who never got the first Kingsfield, this would just be another dungeon. Before I go any further, there's something I've got to do. The leather shield is rightfully mine, now and forever. Before you ask, no, they did not recreate the entirety of Kingsfield 1 in Kingsfield 3. The game has gone on long enough at this point that this light dusting of nostalgia is sufficient. I really don't need the whole kit and caboodle. Jewid's cross has passed away, leaving behind the skull and the 2 bones his body is made of. Eventually you'll face off against one of the game's few bosses. I'm not entirely sure who he's supposed to be, but given that he drops Seath's sword, I'm going to assume that he's an aspect or avatar of Seath. Once you defeat him, you'll approach the boss arena from the first game. A fairy, once released from captivity, creates a light bridge that you can cross. Once there, you see something that would probably be more at home in Bloodborne than Kingsfield. This is Gyra in its purest form, and it repairs the Moonlight Sword. It's not immediately obvious why a big bad is helping us, but I'm not going to look a gift horse in the mouth. I mean, I will look Gyra in the mouth because his mouth is staring back at me. At last, it's time for Lyle to meet his father. Verdite Castle is a fitting challenge, full of the game's toughest enemies, including many unique to this area. No matter how you've played Kingsfield up to this point, you'll be using magic and healing items aplenty to deal with Verdite Castle. It's not the time to be stingy. The music that plays here is also possibly the best track in the game. There's just so much fear, determination, and even some lingering hopelessness towards the task at hand. It's stellar. At last, Lyle confronts the Mad King. For a one-on-one battle, it's pretty good, probably the best in the series. There's a small bag of tricks From uses to keep the battle from feeling too cheap, and I think it's best that they localize those tricks to the end of the game. He does keep running away though, which is kind of annoying.
Get the fuck back here, Dad!
Are you winning, son?
Unsurprisingly, the king's body has been possessed. After being slain by his son, his spirit rises from the grave and blesses his son so that he might conquer the true evil behind Valicia's reoccurring problems, Seath. Gyra was evil, and we did slay him in the previous game, but with his last bit of lingering essence, he repaired the Moonlight Sword for us. Even in death, his conflict with Seath rages on eternal. He may not be a loving god, but in this case, the enemy of his enemy is his friend. Lyle takes his father's sword and battles Seath on what looks like the surface of the moon. The good here is that Seath's design is awesome. I really like his ethereal, crystalline form. Gyra's physical manifestation was some Barney-ass dinosaur, so it's cool to see the designers aim for something more abstract. Also, is it just me, or is there something familiar about his design? The bad part about this is that the fight itself kind of stinks. Seath faces the same problems that the larger bosses in Kingsfield 2 do. The increased scale makes it harder for him to keep tabs on you. It's easy to just circle strafe around and pick at him till he dies. They tried to get around this by having him teleport and kinda swiggity swooty or whatever he's trying to do to get around here, but it's a lost cause as long as you sprint after him. With Seath dead, the darkness consuming the castle is vanquished. We get an ending crawl featuring our favorite voice actor.
He seemed to be listening to something coming from the very light itself.
Brightly does the fire of light burn within your heart, Austin Lyle Forrester. Long have I waited for such a line to be born, after quell the darkness born in the hearts of man and beasts
Holy
alike.
shit. It's a happy ending. Lyle reigns as a beloved king, Lynn comes back to life, and this concludes what is commonly known as the Verdite trilogy. And it's a fantastic conclusion. The entire game, I mean, not this conclusion specifically. Kingsfield 3 is a 2 steps forward, 1 step back for the series. It either removes or trivializes certain elements that made its predecessor special. In exchange, it creates a far more dynamic, explorable world with great dungeons, better combat, and far more ambitious story and lore. All of these aspects would play into the elements that FromSoftware would one day be known for bringing to the table. Each game in the Verdite trilogy is special in its own way. Kingsfield 1, the eldest brother. As the first in the series, it looked outward at other successful games, took what it liked, and developed some eccentricities of its own. It's the strictest, no-nonsense dungeon crawling experience. It's dark, crushing, but that only fuels your desire to reach the end and see it to its conclusion. Kingsfield 2 is the middle brother. With an older brother to learn from, it adopted its predecessor's quirks while expanding upon them in sophisticated ways. Through this, it truly developed the series' identity. It looked inward at itself for innovation, rather than to the games it might be compared to. And because of this, there's really nothing quite like it. Kingsfield 3 is the youngest brother. Brimming with ideas and optimism, it listens to its elders for advice, but boldly sets out into the world to make its own name. In doing so, it exemplifies the best of its intrinsic qualities, while also forgetting what makes the family so special sometimes. In the name of progression and experimentation, it does what is necessary to separate the wheat from the chaff. As a youngest brother myself, I'd have to say that Kingsfield 3 is my favorite of the Verdite trilogy. Much like how I'm the favorite of my parents' quadrilogy. Why else would my mom call every Sunday to see how Majular is doing? That's not how it's pronounced, Mom, but it's doing good, thanks. The breadth of content in the third game is great, the atmosphere is fantastic, and the quality of what we get is very high. No, the game doesn't always take advantage of its 3D space, and difficulty remains a strenuous balancing act. But there are so many ideas, so much variety at work, I can't help but find myself enjoying the experience more than the other games. I've said it once, and now I'll say it again. If I had to recommend any one of these games on the PlayStation, it'd be the third. It exemplifies what Kingsfield is all about. Slow-paced, often confusing dungeon crawling that screws you over until you learn, while serving up tragic stories and Stygian worlds to explore. I still don't readily recommend it to everybody, but that's not an indicator of its quality. That's an indicator of how much I want your quality of life to suffer over the 30 or so hours it might take you to beat. Kingsfield 3 continued to grow the series' cult legacy. It brought enough new fans to the table that FromSoftware was able to diversify its production line. From here, they not only began to develop a number of non-Kingsfield series, but also became prolific publishers as well. Among the games developed after the release of Kingsfield 3 was Armored Core, the first entry in a well-loved series that continues to this very day. It would not only represent a commercial success for From, but inadvertently take the studio back to their roots, as Kingsfield initially began development as a mecha game before Nishida's guiding hand was involved. Having cut their teeth on the Kingsfield games, they also introduced some more experimental projects into their roster. One such example of this is Echo Knight, a narrative adventure game with a strong emphasis on storytelling and puzzle solving. The concept came of From's desire for lavish visual detail in their games. Being hamstrung by hardware, the only way they could implement this was in small, sectioned-off zones, perfect for a point-and-click adventure. These days, From is known for both their exquisite graphical details and large open worlds, so I guess you could say things really worked out for them in the end. Another game released around this time would be less of a departure from their previous work. Shadow Tower released in 1998, a first-person dungeon-crawling RPG running on an improved Kingsfield 3 engine. Shadow Tower is perhaps best compared to the first game in the Verdite trilogy, taking place in a suffocating underground city occupied by demonic denizens. Despite its many similarities to Kingsfield, I think the story of Shadow Tower is one for another time. Before tucking into our next adventure, I should also mention that in the year 2000, FromSoftware released a piece of software called the Sword of Moonlight Kingsfield Making Tool. It was a Windows application which allowed users to create their own Kingsfield-like games. Although it was never officially released outside of Japan, it still has a fan base to this day who use it to develop their own stories. This is thanks to good old John Osborne, who has painstakingly translated the SOM, as well as all of its utilities. Unreal level of dedication. Sadly, I wasn't able to get it working on my PC, but it appears to be a pretty robust set of dev tools, simple to use with a relatively high usage ceiling. You can use the game's many pre-made assets or import your own textures, models, and music. Using a trigger-based event system, you can even have dialogue and story beats play out. As you can see, my Voodoo 2 graphics card simply isn't enough to handle the overwhelming power of SOM's awesomeness. This sourced footage should show you how capable a lot of users were. Nothing that would even come close to Kingsfield in tone or quality, but there have been some interesting little projects. It puts a smile on my face to see some of these fan games. It reminds me of a simpler internet era. Suffice to say, this was a period of growth and productivity for FromSoftware. Never before had they taken on so many projects, some failures and others successes. Nishida, who was hired as a writer, became a major figure in the company, designing, directing, and producing many of the company's high-profile releases. Amidst all of the new IPs and existing properties, there was a common link in From's games: hardware limitations. From the moment Naotoshi Jin saw the affine texture mapping ripping the walls of the Royal Cemetery asunder, they had yearned for more processing wiggle room. Their wishes would come true in 2000 with the release of the PlayStation 2. Not wasting any time, they supplied the console with not one but two launch titles. Armored Core 2, a sequel to their fast-paced mecha shooter, and Eternal Ring. Like Shadow Tower, it was a distinct IP but shared much in common with Kingsfield. The difficulty was toned down, focusing instead on dialogue and storytelling. The malevolent low fantasy was subdued in favor of a brighter anime aesthetic. It did not sell well, and it did not score well, but it did allow From to cut their teeth on the PS2's hardware, which would be critically important for what would come next.
Silence, solitude, ruins, darkness and light. 3D real-time RPG, Kingsfield 4.
In 2001, FromSoftware released Kingsfield 4: The Ancient City. Jean was no longer at the helm, perhaps due to his heightened responsibilities as company president. Instead, Nishida produced the project while a pair of fresh faces in the company, Rintaro Yamada and Satoru Yanagi, were charged with directing the game. With a new console came new ideas. Kingsfield 4 wouldn't take place in Verdite. In fact, it wouldn't even mention the previous games. Having been non-numerically released as Kingsfield: The Ancient City in North America, the fourth game would act as a soft reboot in many ways. The game once again opens up with a voiceover.
The idol must be returned. Under a dark and cloudy sky, the Swordmaster led his men to the ancient land.
It's a good impression, but that's not our boy.
You shall be known as the Golden King.
We learn of an ancient city hidden deep within the land. Here, a warning is written.
Grave misfortune will befall those who behold the idol that stares into the darkness.
An idol created by the ancient forest folk was brought to the kingdom of Helidon, after which the land fell into darkness. The Swordmaster and his men attempted to return the idol from whence it came, but failed in their quest. The idol was lost and unable to be returned. It seemed the darkness would last forever. One night, Prince Devian of the nearby kingdom of Azalan is given the idol by a mysterious hooded stranger. At once he set out on a quest to return the idol to the forsaken land that it had come from. So, without Naotoshi Jin at the helm and without the kingdom of Verdite as the setting, the question is Kingsfield 4 a real Kingsfield game? I must insist that the answer is yes. Let's start with the obvious. Production value of the pre-rendered cutscenes is significantly higher. I mean, in the previous game, the pre-rendered scenes just looked like in-engine cutscenes. This is good, it's cinematic, it's not even a far cry from the Demon Souls introduction, which wouldn't be a thing for another 8 years. More importantly, the change of setting is one of the most interesting things about Kingsfield 4. To me, by this point, Verdite was a pretty big part of the Kingsfield lineage. Seath, Gyra, Alfred, all names that were used repeatedly throughout the games. By Kingsfield 3, there was a real effort in expanding on this lore, so it seems like an odd time to kill that in favor of something completely different. And this game is nothing if not different. Well, let me correct myself, it's familiar in a lot of surface level ways. The game controls more or less the same way, same items, same combat. The differences may initially be subtle, but they will become more prevalent over the course of the game. Even as a self-proclaimed Kingsfield veteran by this point, the game really puts me in a bad spot. The opening area's man-eaters are actually kind of getting the better of me. This is the most humiliated I've been in games. The first key difference I notice is that Kingsfield 4 is slow. The other Kingsfield games are slow, but this is like fucking slow. Your movement speed is reduced, which is a bit of a pain when it comes to avoiding enemies, but the real kicker is the turn speed. It's brutal. It takes about 25% longer to make a full rotation than the previous Kingsfield games, which doesn't sound like much, but when you're trying to pivot to face an enemy or make a quick escape, it's noticeable. Aside from this, the first and most immediately noticeable aspect of Kingsfield 4 is its visuals. For a 2001 PlayStation 2 game, it looks fantastic. The textures are actually recognizable. I do think the bilinear filtering kills a bit of that Kingsfield pixel magic, but it's a necessary evil. The whole game is awash with much richer colors and some very good baked lighting that really sells the contrast between lighter and darker areas. Even though the faceless NPCs became something of a series staple, they would be out of place given this more realistic visual style. Ancient City compromises nicely, giving faces identifiable features and expressiveness, that expression usually being sadness. But there's sort of an ink-smudged quality to the faces that gives them a stylistic flair, keeping them just uncanny enough to fit in with Kingsfield's trademark weirdness. It probably goes without saying that draw distance is massively improved as well. The game still intentionally uses sight-limiting fog in different areas, but the improved field of vision really helps sell the sense of scale. There are some genuinely awesome moments in this game because of it. Model quality is good for a PS2 game, not the best I've seen, but the characters, enemies, and objects still look fantastic, mostly because of the texture work. It's hard to pinpoint exactly what it is, but there's a unique quality to the textures that just screams Kingsfield 4. Almost like everything is covered in a layer of grime or dust. Combine that with the lighting and vastly superior animation, and it's just a recipe for a game that always looks better than it has any right to. The only real issue I have with the visuals is, ironically, the first issue that From had with Kingsfield 1. Well, sort of. Textures warp in ways I find quite immersion-breaking. It almost emulates the look of PS1 affine texture mapping, but it's not. I believe it's related to the game's internal level of detail system, which gradually redraws textures at a higher or lower resolution as you move closer or further away from them. Given how busy the textures are, in scenes with a lot of walls especially, it makes everything subtly vibrate in a weird way. It's mostly noticeable in this opening area. It's full of cliff faces that use more complex geometry than most of the game, so all of the jagged edges are on full display. It's here we meet a lot of NPCs that want to die, and then come across one that doesn't want to die, but is dying, as well as her daughter that's mean to dogs. Oh man, I didn't know she'd die. I just went into incognito mode and looked up a list of games where you can kill children, and Kingsfield 4 wasn't in it. This is a stark discovery. I'm very disappointed in myself. Finding a rock of life to heal the sick woman is the game's way of immersing you in the various systems. You'll find equipment and be forced to learn how to use it. The equipment screen UI is much better than anything from the previous games. On top of having a maximum equipment load, your weapons also now have durability. This is mainly a problem in the beginning of the game, and you'll be forced to switch weapons sometimes because of it. There's an even greater emphasis on damage types in this game, so between that and weapon durability, there's good reasons to keep a stockpile of equipment instead of selling it all. The caves where you find the Rock of Life are full of labyrinthian passages and poison. The shrewd investigator will have noticed that behind the woman's house, there's a small tunnel full of very easy to kill enemies and antidotes that respawn after a set amount of time. Immediately, the game punishes those who rush headlong into danger and rewards those who take their time. Given the slower pace of the fourth game, there are often times where not choosing to stop and look around leads to certain death. This is a good way of driving that home. The cave itself is full of passages that are deadly, full of toxic gas and enemies likely above your pay grade. This is a signal that you can leave, via ladder no less, predating Bethesda's ability to program ladders by like 20 years, and so you can leave and just come back another time. This whole section is an effective diegetic tutorial, and of all the lessons you'll learn, you can come back later is perhaps the most important. Of course, you don't have to come back later, you can skip these excursions entirely, or you can try your luck. You might die and you might have to reload, but if you succeed, you're often rewarded with equipment that outmatches what you already have. So much damn equipment. This game goes full on skeletons with its equipment, in the sense that there's a lot of it. Due to the visual detail, it's a lot easier to spot most of the traps in this game. Sometimes though, they hide the traps so effectively that I'd say it borders on unfair. The ash in the beginning immediately gives way and kills you if you walk on it. I mean, I'm colorblind, that's my excuse. Ash just looks like regular ground to me. To be fair, the time to be teaching such harsh lessons is probably in the first 5 seconds of the game, where dying to such a trap is more humorous than frustrating, but I'm still not sure about a lot of these. I'd like to think that all damage should be avoidable in an action game, even one paced such as this. After introducing you to the game via poison caves, you're also given your first magic spell. It's probably a good idea to have you work for it. It makes you more inclined to use it and figure out how it works. The thing is, the amount of MP you have in this game is pathetic. I can cast Fireball more times consecutively in real life than Deviant, and magic isn't even real where I live. The game very early on gives you a bracelet that massively increases the amount of MP you have, like to a useful amount. Outside of a mandatory section, there is essentially no reason to remove this bracelet throughout the entire game. It is the sole factor making magic viable. What I don't understand is that it's a deliberate change from the first 3 games, and also an unnecessary one. They impair you where such an impairment isn't necessary, and then provide the solution immediately, as if to say, see? Aren't we nice? And I'm just like, no! You're not, actually. While the opening poison caves get your feet wet, it's here where the meat and potatoes of Kingsfield 4 really begins. This dungeon is exactly what one might imagine the previous game's dungeons would have looked like if they'd had the power. While searching barrels, I hear the pitter-patter of petite skeleton feet. A hidden door with a skeleton behind it. I'll be damned. Years of experience have trained me for this moment. I will slay the skeleton and claim the treasure, which is... are you fucking kidding me? Still, within the chest is another crappy leather shield. A hidden wall with a skeleton behind it, guarded reward that I'm becoming very nostalgic for. You'll meet some NPCs such as the rogue, Chad. He's one of the few characters that buys and sells items. This makes him incredibly important. In the tradition of Lyn from the previous title, you'll find characters moving around the game at certain predetermined points. Chad will definitely become the most familiar of faces. If nothing else, the NPCs having their own prerogatives makes you unsure that a pilgrimage back to Chad's chill zone will bear any fruit. That's because Chad is a chill zone nomad, where once was chill may now be infested with bad vibes, so you'll just have to hope you'll bump into him again on your travels. This unreliability also makes it important that you're always well stocked. 99 medicinal herbs are no longer a fast travel away. Well, for the most part. More on that later. Eventually, you'll reach the center point and namesake of Kingsfield 4, the ancient city. Arriving here and taking in the scale of this place is a pretty great moment, and this is only one of many floors. Like Kingsfield 2, this place heavily relies on interconnectivity, more than ever before, I'd say. The entire game is made up of serpentine passageways, both leading to distinct areas as well as looping back to each other. The perplexing removal of the compass only serves to confuse the shit out of you, and the scarcity of maps just makes things worse. You really have to pay attention to your surroundings. In Kingsfield 2, you could stumble around the dark and eventually find your destination, but the ancient city feels much less kind. This place wants you to be lost. It revels in your panic as you realize you're somewhere you shouldn't be with no idea how to escape. You are bestowed a small mercy in the form of gems and wands, which serve an identical purpose to the keys and gates of Kingsfield 2. Find a gem, slot it into a statue near a save point, and then use the wand to travel to wherever that gem is slotted. There are 5 in all, although some are only accessible near the very end of the game. It's critically important to choose your warp point carefully. Certain wands are found before their associated keys, so using them will teleport you to a predetermined spot. This serves as a sort of hint, like you'll probably need to be here eventually, so maybe leave the gem here. As you make your way through each area, you'll find shortcuts in the form of stairways and doors barred from one side that give you more ways to get around. With more ways comes more responsibilities. You're cursed with having to keep track of which doors lead where. Since the ancient city itself looks so indistinguishable, you'll really have to find small landmarks and use them as hints for later. There are a few maps in the game, and their usefulness varies greatly. One map gives you a pretty detailed view of central ancient city, and that comes in handy. But by the time you get it, you'll probably have been through the ringer and know the city pretty well. Much later in the game, you can find a 3D auto map that is exceptionally helpful, right when you don't really need it anymore. Frankly, I think they should have given this to you right in the beginning, sort of like a Pixies map. The confusion and guesswork involved in choosing where to go next is not a critical component of the difficulty, I think. Being able to tell where you've already been still leaves massive unexplored areas to get lost in, so the game could have given you a small leg up here. Still, part of the fun of the ancient city is getting just a little bit lost. As is series tradition, when you're going the wrong way, the game will often signal such, with tough enemies or more blatantly with key-specific locked doors. There is a sort of joy in exploration, realizing that you've definitively found the right way or coming across a key that exponentially opens up your possibilities. The problem with having to keep track of where you've been is that you often just can't. It's not reasonable to expect a non-Mensa member such as myself to keep track of every room and door. When you come across a locked door or inaccessible area, there are two distinct possibilities. The better of these two is that you're just not ready for that area and you can come back later. The much worse of the two is that you missed something. In a game as big as this, as confusing and unhelpful as this, missing something is very bad. That is why you have to play extremely thoroughly, more so than ever before. If that hallway looks like it'll progress things, go back and check the other hallways first. Leave no stone unturned. Write yourself notes. Make your own damn map if you have to. Just don't trust yourself to remember that for later, because you won't. And that's okay, you still have intrinsic value even though you're not in Mensa, but no, you won't remember. The combat is further improved here in many of the ways that King's Field 3 was, but to a much starker degree. Enemy behaviors are unique and varied like never before. Encountering a new enemy is often a matter of adapting your strategy, meaning circle strafing is once again just a tool in the box rather than a winning strategy. Some enemies will do menacing biker circles around the player, requiring you to predict their destination and swing in advance of that. Other enemies will charge or jump at you, forcing you to bait on their lunges and sprint out of the way. Flying enemies now have more realistic and unpredictable behaviors, forcing you to use your bow or projectile spells more often. In general, attack windows are quite narrow as well. Timing is key. Thankfully, even though you're still heavily limited in your movement, the fights feel more fair and fun while maintaining their challenge. Sometimes the expanded enemy movesets in previous games left you feeling like you were outmatched, but this usually isn't the case in the fourth game. Since enemy models are comprised of more detailed skeletons, their animations are more realistic. You can usually tell when an enemy is winding up to do a particular attack, as opposed to just watching helplessly as their limbs move autonomously. High reward attacks from foes open them up to greater risks. That's reciprocated to the player as well. The variety of weapons you can find far outmatches anything in the series yet. Daggers and short swords have fast swings and your stamina bar refills quickly when using them, but their damage often leads to long endurance battles. Two-handed swords deal significantly more damage, but their animations are clumsy and the refill bar is slow. You can't hold a shield while using them either. With more enemies having different elemental and defensive properties, choosing the right weapon for the occasion is more important than ever. That also applies to armor. Rather than arbitrarily picking the set with the best defense, you'll have to choose your armor situationally. Some is suited to guarding against certain elemental damage, other armors are light and free up your equipment load. The gear with the best raw defense is almost always cumbersome. As you level up, you'll gain more hit points, strength, and carry weight, so build variety isn't really a thing here. You always have your pick of the litter when it comes to weapons and armor. I'd mention that the game now features a durability system. I find gear degradation systems are often contentious. People often feel very strongly in favor or in opposition to them. I usually like durability because I like having more complexity, more moment-to-moment decision-making and systems over top of everything. In certain cases, repair systems themselves can be little games within the game. That's not really the case here, and I find this particular durability system doesn't add much to the game. In order to repair or enhance existing weapons, you'll have to rescue a dwarf and come visit him with certain materials. The game takes real-world time, usually around 10 minutes in my experience, for your gear to be repaired or upgraded. That itself is kind of a waste of time. There's not really a good reason I can think of to stall you. I mean, you'll only be upgrading the weapons you actually plan on using, right? So it's not like you'll go play somewhere else for 10 minutes using a weapon you hate and then come back. Upgrading really only provides marginal stat increases too, so you'll have to wait repeatedly if you want to make any kind of difference. This is in addition to the game's weapon level ups. Your gear will gain effectiveness the more it's used. I had such a revolving door of weapons that I never really used anyone enough to level it, and I never really felt like I suffered for it, but I guess it's nice that it's there. There's also a statue nearby that allows you to warp to the smith if you place a gem here, so that's thoughtful, I guess. All in all, this was an attempt to add another layer of realism and challenge to the game, and I respect that, especially considering how important such things would go on to be in Demon's Souls and beyond. But here it mostly strikes me as a waste of time. If you're the kind of person who just immediately sells all their weapons, well, first of all, I don't care to know you, but second of all, you're probably the type of person who might actually get some mileage out of this. I personally found durability to be little more than a minor annoyance. The abundance of gear does mean you're often rewarded for exploring. Not that this isn't the case in previous games, but quality weapons and armor were quite rare, usually saved for the endgame side quests. Here you'll come across useful stuff often. This breadcrumb trail of micro rewards definitely helps that feeling that you're making progress. Even if you end up going in the quote-unquote wrong direction, there'll often be a treat waiting for you if you keep your eyes peeled. Some people might say that having tons of stuff devalues that stuff, and I mean, yeah, that's true. The game counters that devaluing by providing more meaningful distinctions between types of gear. In Kingsfield 2, you might only meet a handful of enemies weak to a particular element. In Kingsfield 4, there's probably an entire area or two in-game full of enemies weak to that particular element. In the case of the Forge area, that's doubly true. It starts out frozen over, low visibility with ice-type enemies spawning in and certain areas out of reach. Then the lava begins flowing, which melts the ice. That changes the types of enemies you face, as well as changing the areas that are accessible. Later still, the lava will be lowered, which allows you to reach even more areas that were previously lethally hot, but that's neither here nor there. The point is that Kingsfield 4 gets more mileage out of your gear and the levels that you use them in. It's a similar feeling to Kingsfield 2, where little is disposable. I appreciate the return to that ethos, since it's undoubtedly the hardest to design around. Speaking of that reuse, crystal flasks are back once again, and the game does quite a good job of balancing their use. First of all, again, they are rare, rarer than ever before. The problem with flasks in previous games is that they were cheapened by how effective consumable healing items are. This is still an issue in the fourth game, but it's lessened significantly. The amount of health your character gains each level becomes orders of magnitude higher than the last few games. This means that higher level enemies will do more damage. This also means that the usefulness of those early game medicinal herbs suffers from diminishing returns. They quickly become less effective. By the end of the game, you might have to use 7 or 8 just to get your health back up, and you're capped to having 99 in all. This forces you to use either your reusable flasks or another consumable called herbal liquid, which is just an upgraded version of the herbs. The problem with the liquid is that there's a finite number in the game. They're definitely more effective than herbs, but at a certain point, vendors will just stop selling them. Herbs are infinite, so you can never truly be screwed over, but their benefits become so insignificant in the face of your health pool that it's just way more prudent to rely on flasks with herbs as a supplementary measure, rather than the other way around. It's good for the structure of this game because it means you have to start planning your journeys and gem placements based on where fountains are. It also means flasks are treasures worthy of the trouble you go through to get them, although not all water is created equal. What the? Oh, is it fucking poisonous? Thank you. There's an issue I have with Kingsfield 4 that I didn't have with any of the other games. The game just feels a little too comfortable wasting my precious time. It's one thing to have your character's rotation speed equivalent to those baby bounce things, but the number of rooms just filled to the brim with enemies you have to get past is maddening. Just gotta carve a path through these mushrooms, one very slow swing at a time. Oh, you've gotta be shitting me. Every time I kill one, another shows up to take his place. Jason and the Argonauts ass bullshit. Sometimes enemy placement is very strategic, obviously meant to enforce a certain kind of challenge. Other times the game developers are just like,
100 skeletons, very funny, haha.
In a game where every swing is a 7-second commitment, 100 skeletons is an 11.6 repeating minute middle finger. Now that I've reached my temporary negativity capacity, I'd like to focus on something overwhelmingly positive. Something that Kingsfield 4 does amazingly, outstandingly well. Atmosphere. You tired of hearing that word yet? Well, I'm not tired of saying it, so strap in. You're going on the atmospheric ride of a lifetime. In all seriousness, I just can't escape from this nebulous concept because it's what characterizes the series for me. Atmosphere, atmosphere, atmosphere. That's 3 out of the 25 right there. Each Kingsfield game brings its own totally unique and magical vibe to the table, and Kingsfield 4 is a masterclass in atmosphere. It is Atmosphere the game. The reason your character moves so slowly is because he's wading through 66 million gallons of atmosphere. Let's talk about it. Dark is a word I've used to describe many aspects of these games, but that is exceptionally true in the case of this game. The Verdite trilogy was characterized by a loneliness, a feeling of oppression that's constantly present. You felt as if the world wanted to kill you, and it did. By God, it did. Despite the brutality of the situation, you're always given slivers of hope, although with each game, that hope seemed to wane. Where each of those games had a unique ambience, they were all bound by common principles. Similar soundtracks, visual design, and just the way that they felt to play. Kingsfield 4 feels the most different out of all of these games. It's not just visual design and improved technology, although that is certainly a component. The game has a dark atmosphere that is wholly distinct yet equally intoxicating as that from the Verdite trilogy. It's less an oppressive sense of danger and more an absolute feeling of hopelessness that is seldom abated. The first thing you see as you load up the game is a gray, static sky, but yours is not to question why. You only know that you're here in this dead land on a desperate mission. There's no prophecy, there's only death and failure, as exemplified by the demoralized citizens of this place. If they're not dying or dead, they're waiting to die. Never has abandon all hope ye who enter here been more applicable than the ancient city. Whatever lives here does not want you leaving. This city will be your tomb. Due to the slow movement speed, you trudge through these dead environments with plenty of time to scrutinize your surroundings and wonder where it all went wrong. The lack of explanations and in-game tutorials is critical in establishing this loneliness. The game is committed to your absolute immersion from the moment you start the game. No cutscenes, no fourth wall breaking. If there's something critical to explain, you'll find it in the manual. And hey, sometimes you won't. This city, full of ancient sentinels and rusted apparatus, wasn't built for you, but you still have to contend with it. You're forced into experimentation, understanding how these machines and implements work through your intuition. Sometimes that intuition may be misguided. Maybe you bring a golem to life and trap yourself. Maybe you use one of your precious bridge keys in the wrong place. You're often your own worst enemy. This makes the limited save points, statues fashioned as some kind of a Cthulhu nightmare, precious commodities indeed. The game often borders on horror, not just because there's literal xenomorphs from the movie Alien running around either. Through excellent use of lighting, sound design, and music, you're constantly on edge. Slow turn speeds force you to keep your eyes peeled, and dark rooms represent the unknown. Still, there are brief moments throughout the game where you come up for air. The holy forest with its green trees and living fauna represents hope in this destitute world. It's the only place where you can feel at ease, even though for the elves of this world it represents a life that was taken away from them. The vestiges of something good still remain here, but inevitably it'll be time to, once again, descend into the ancient city. More than any other game I've talked about today, the music is responsible for establishing Kingsfield 4's tone. I don't think it's controversial to say that it's got the best soundtrack of the four, though it's not immediately clear why that is. The music was composed by Tsukasa Saito, a recent addition to From staff at the time. The name may sound familiar to you because he's provided compositions for many of From's games since, including Dark Souls, Bloodborne, and Elden Ring, including the latter's iconic title track. Kingsfield 4 has a highly unconventional soundtrack, especially compared with the previous games. The note and instrument choices create a strong feeling of dissonance and unease. The music isn't orchestrated, it's all synthesized, which is actually a good thing in this case. Under the right circumstances, fake instruments have an uncanny valley effect to them. It's like your brain can recognize that you're not hearing the authentic article. That's especially true, for me at least, when it comes to these vocal tracks. They're pitched so high and unnaturally, it just gives me the chills. There's also a heavy use of reverb in many of these tracks, which sells that increased sense of scale that the fourth game is all about. It sounds like echoing throughout this chamber. A lot of the dungeon tracks fall somewhere between music and dark ambience. I don't even know how to explain the instrumentals. It's like a monster shrieking and metal scraping. Just bizarre samples, but so effective. Listening to it makes me feel like my mind is trying to grab onto something familiar or recognizable, but there's just nothing there. Many of the tracks are strangely optimistic, but not in a way that invites you to the party. They sound evil, devilish, like the world is laughing at your misfortune, amused that you're even trying. There's very little by way of callbacks to the previous game's soundtracks, although the harpsichord is back in a big way, baby. Harpsichord supremacy reigns, Carillion Dorks BTFO. The similarities between the track Damp Tomb and Radiohead's Paranoid Android go a little bit beyond coincidence, but hey, JRPG composers lifted from Emerson, Lake and Palmer's Tarkus for years. I can dig it. There are several other tracks I want to talk about, but I'll do so contextually throughout the video. I just wanted to draw attention to the music. For years, a friend of mine talked up the game's soundtrack, but I never really understood what he saw in it. That is, until I played the game myself. The unorthodoxy of the music perfectly fits in with the bizarre nature of Kingsfield's world. It really elevates the haunting atmosphere to a new level, and I can't imagine the game without it. Something I found very interesting about my time with Kingsfield 4 is just how much it reminded me of Dark Souls 2. Depending on which school of Dark Souls thought you come from, this could be a terrible thing or a fantastic thing. If you're a rational adult, hopefully it's just a neutral thing and you'll let me extrapolate without making any snap judgments. Of the Dark Souls trilogy, it's no secret that the second game is the black sheep. There are a number of changes, namely to combat and world design, that didn't sit right with a lot of people. I've gone through many phases of Dark Souls 2 elitism and detractorism. No matter where I was in the cycle though, I did appreciate Dark Souls 2's atmosphere. There is such a strangeness to its existence. It feels less like a cohesive game world and more like a series of disconnected levels. There's something about the nonsensical area transitions, repeating textures, and baffling existence of certain characters that makes it feel like a PS2 game marooned in a place and time it doesn't belong. There's also a ton of aesthetic similarities between Kingsfield 4 and Dark Souls 2, more than I could reasonably go over in this section of the video. I think it makes sense to draw this line between Dark Souls 2 and Kingsfield because, first of all, Naotoshi Jin came back to Dark Souls 2 as lead game designer, a job he hadn't done for many years. Nishida was also project manager and designer on the Scholar of the First Sin version. Finally, and probably the straightest line to draw between these two games, is that Keiichiro Ogawa, lead artist of Kingsfield 4, also acted as lead artist of Dark Souls 2. Souls is the heir apparent of Kingsfield, but I found some of the specifics fascinating. If you've played and, God forbid, enjoyed Dark Souls 2, maybe this will help give you a sense of what I liked about Kingsfield 4's tone. I didn't notice until close to the end of my time with this game, but there's a major difference its game world has in comparison with its predecessors. It's another facet of the game one could parallel to the Souls games. In Kingsfield 1 to 3, you're largely exploring existing civilizations. The Royal Cemetery, the villages of Melanotte Island, the towns and dungeons of Verdite. There's an immediate familiarity in these locations as extensions of the game's medieval world. That's not the case in Kingsfield 4, which features a much less conventional setting. You're not exploring the character's homeland, you're heading into a mysterious land of sorrow and darkness. The ancient city, built long ago by a mysterious race that no longer exists. Surrounding the city are forgotten ruins, caverns, and settlements from similarly alien societies. You're not retaking the land that was yours or expelling evil from a place that was once good. There's no way to tell what will be there. God knows what you'll find or what gods are the center of worship here at all. It's unclear what happened to the people of the ancient city, but it's obvious that they were pretty advanced. There's magic at work here, and it seems the culture had developed over time. Through the passageways, you'll find pockets of more primitive civilization. In the seabed cave to the north, crestfallen soldiers don't know how to progress. On top of small fire-breathing dragons, they've also been dealing with the Widda, a race of bipedal lizard folk that aren't really interested in trying to talk to you. Their ocean fortress is a fun house, the likes of which I haven't seen since, well, I guess the last Kingsfield game. Packed with enemies and traps, you ascend the fortress to find the Widda treasures. Donning their gear will open the way further into the Widda city, which becomes even more confusing, even more deadly, and even scarier, mostly thanks to the music. It seems that the swordmaster from the introduction, Septiago, has perished. This marks the end of any hope that his entourage had survived. It also raises questions about what might be waiting for us further in. On his body can be found the Lawful Blade, a sword which is said to have dormant powers that the Widda feared. Without knowing much about the Widda, it seems their civilization is centered around the cycles of death and rebirth. The Queen's palace is guarded by a warden, a grave warden if you will. He states that the living are not allowed to walk freely in the palace. Coffins line the walls and the dead come back to life in defense of their home. The city is interconnected via a series of rails and carts, all immaculately carved out of stone. Across from the Queen's palace are the hatching grounds, a vast subterranean expanse where precious Widda eggs are carefully guarded and hatched. The music changes from a horror track to a grand and stately tune, straight out of the Baroque era. Not the type of music you'd usually associate with eggs, but then, what is? Further in still, you find the ruins of the Dark Folk, a complex network of tombs, graveyards, and sarcophagi. However it happened, it seems the Dark Folk were wiped out via a massive flood that left them with nowhere to go. Whether the Widda are the evolutionary conclusion of the Dark Folk, or their guardians, or something completely different, it's unclear. But it does seem that many of the water-based enemies in this area are undergoing some kind of adaptation. It really makes you think about how long this area has been abandoned, and what happened, why did it happen? Were they sealed in? However it occurred, it seemed the Dark Folk put a little too much stock into the dark. Go figure. The Kingsfield series is in many ways about the balance between light and dark. Seath and Gyra, the elves of the forest and the dwarves of the earth. However ambiguously it's presented in Kingsfield 4, it's clear that the destruction which once plagued this land is the result of this imbalance. This is furthered by a journal entry stating that the forest folk built a palace to honor the light. As the light became more intense, the forest folk began to fear it. It shone brighter and the shadows it cast became darker, so to speak. The darkness manifested itself as a being referred to as the Dark One. It seems that despite the Dark Folk being sealed, the darkness they once trusted seeped into the world above, killing the forest folk, the original denizens of the ancient city. Thus began a war between the two factions, a war that rages on in various ways to this day. After traveling through much of the Dark Folk's ruins, the music abruptly shifts to this melancholic acoustic track. It's not dark or scary or intense, it's mostly just sad and nostalgic. The enemies are primitive, giants literally knuckle-dragging, trying to smash your head in with a club. Not the type of music you'd usually associate with grug fighting, but then, what is? At the top of the highest tower, at the highest point in the ruins, you meet a man named Serik Resmak, who's turned himself into stone. Obsessed with creating life in order to battle the Dark Folk, he created a race that would turn on the forest folk called the Genians. He petrified himself as punishment, a small tragedy within a much larger tragedy. The purpose of this excursion, along with many others in this game, is to hunt down one of the four Guardians. These are big bads that were given keys by the Dark One. The first thing to note here is that boss battles return. They're improved over the boss battles in Kingsfield 2, but still face some of the same fundamental problems. With this combat framework, there's only so much an enemy can actually do while still allowing you to avoid and inflict damage. Some bosses are straightforward one-on-one encounters, others will be giant enemies, somewhat in the vein of the squid in Kingsfield 2. You have to watch what limb he'll use to swing and dodge accordingly. Then there's enemies like the Widda Queen, who's just a bullshit idiot that poisons you, swings at you, sends projectiles at you, and then fills the room with infinitely respawning snakes that nibble at your toes. Stuff like this is sort of the worst of the worst as far as I'm concerned, simply because it's the wrong approach to difficulty. Kingsfield 3 got it more right. In a series that isn't afraid to shirk tradition, bosses can weigh down the experience, especially when used in excess. It's kind of funny in hindsight, given that bosses are universally seen as one of From's high points nowadays. Another interesting thing about this game's structure is that much of it is optional. This isn't the first time we've seen such a thing, but it's impressive just how much of the game is left in the player's hands. Sequence breaking isn't just possible, the game actively tries to trick you into it, especially in the beginning. The King's Palace is accessible from close to the start, and it can lead you down a variety of cruel and unusual rabbit holes. The difference between following the intended path and just beelining to the end of the game is so stark that collecting all of the spells is its own speedrunning distinction. There's also just a simple matter of power. Again, the difference in health and power between low and high level characters is massive. You don't have a snowball's chance in hell with some of these tougher enemies unless you're one of those people who plays through Dark Souls with Donkey Konga drums. But the main reason to go through the trouble of defeating the Guardians and collecting the keys is because that's the only way to collect the Black Eyes. Once you have them, slotting them in this door will allow you to access the Holy Forest Altar. Your lawful blade will be taken and exchanged for, say the line, Bart, the Moonlight Sword. Now you're ready to dispel the darkness infesting this land once and for all. On top of having a lot of in-game historical significance, the final few areas of Kingsfield 4 are unlike anything we've seen in the series yet. Demons and undead infest the ancient battlegrounds, the site at which the forest folk and dark folk clashed long ago. The area has become haunted and fetid, littered with massive skeletal remains. Say, I wonder if I can make that. Towards the end of this area is the Altar of Darkness. Returning the Idol of Sorrow onto its pedestal, the idol shatters and you fall into Flesh Hell Cave? What a time for a main theme reprise. This is a truly alien world full of enemies so deadly that you're better off sprinting past them than engaging them. It's the most out-and-out horrifying area across the entire series, and it's a fitting end level to its most horror-heavy game. It still fucking sucks though. These enemies spawn at rates that you can't contend with, and hopefully you filled up your flasks beforehand because you're not avoiding some kind of damage here. Also, if you die, which you're gonna, probably, the last save point was quite a while ago, so the anxiety is ramped up to a fever pitch here. The boss of the game is really more of a set piece than a traditional boss, which is perfectly fine as far as I'm concerned. It's a grotesque, fleshy amalgamation that is the Dark One's physical manifestation. Kinda reminds me of Gyra. In order to defeat it, you have to hit it with your sword. And then you fall. Then, with Moonlight Sword in hand, you walk back, your will strengthened, your resolve steeled. You lift the blade to cleave the fiend, and... Okay, honestly now. Third time's a charm. Alright, okay, there we go. The Dark One is slain, the source of this all-encompassing evil has been destroyed. We can't bring back the lives of the innocent, but we can stop their tragic history from repeating itself. Although the game is certainly the grimmest of the series, its ending leaves us on the highest note. Light cuts through the dark clouds, the forest itself seals entry to the land of sorrow. One never knows what tomorrow will bring, but for today, there is peace. Now Toshi-Jin's influence, or rather lack thereof, is strongly felt throughout the entirety of this game. It's the first and last Kingsfield game to firmly step in a lateral direction, rather than directly iterate on its predecessor. What results is an experience that stands beautifully on its own. The technological benefits of the PlayStation 2 are evident from the moment you boot up the game. You're dragged into this brutal world, absorbed by its eccentric style, its haunting music, and its gameplay, which sits somewhere between meditative and exasperating. It's slow and it's unkind, and when I use those words to describe a game in this series, then you know it's like really, really true. Like me with about 70% of the game's enemies, Kingsfield 4 sometimes swings and misses. There are some changes that seem arbitrary, a few that negatively affect the experience, but thankfully the majority of them are for the better. In a series drenched in atmosphere, the ancient city manages to ascend beyond the standards set by its forebearers. That alone is impressive, but its uniqueness is what really stands out to me as special. There is nothing like this game, and I don't think there ever will be again. There are games that come close, spiritually, mechanically, even visually. But this is lightning in a bottle. There is a je ne sais quoi to Kingsfield 4 that cannot be reduced, synthesized, or summed up. If you've played the game, then I don't need to tell you, and I couldn't if I wanted to, because it's not words or thoughts, but feelings associated with this game that I'm talking about. There's probably a reason that of all of the Kingsfield games, the fourth is held onto the tightest by its longtime cult fanbase. There are still people being newly absorbed into these games, curious about the origins of their favorite series. Once you get over the initial hurdles, what awaits you is one of the most interesting, bullshit, beautiful, depressing, sophisticated, unfair, and unforgettable experiences you'll have playing a PS2 game. After Kingsfield 4, it seemed that FromSoftware was prepared to close the book on the series. With the success of Armored Core and the abundance of new projects they were taking on, From's fast pace of business no longer matched the cautious footsteps of Kingsfield. A sequel to Shadow Tower, titled Shadow Tower Abyss, would receive a Japan-only release in October of 2003. While akin to Kingsfield, it would represent the last Kingsfield-like game that From had in the cards. That is until 2006 when they would release two back-to-back PSP titles, Kingsfield Additional 1 and Kingsfield Additional 2. Like Shadow Tower Abyss, they would release in Japan only and feature a very different style of gameplay. The games were 2D dungeon crawlers and action RPGs at the same time. Unfortunately, because I don't speak Japanese, I wasn't able to get very far. To be honest, Kingsfield Additional is such a vastly different experience that I'm not sure I'd invest the time anyway. The game once again takes place in Verdite after a rebellion has driven the current Tyrant King into hiding. He's believed to be hiding in a mysterious labyrinth, which is where your mercenary character is headed. It seems the game ties back to some things in the previous Kingsfield, extrapolating on the existing lore while telling its own story. I can't say much about it aside from the fact that the artwork is quite nice and the soundtrack is surprisingly good. Combat seems interesting as well. It's a combination of turn-based and real-time. Enemies will indicate when they're attacking, which forces you to raise your shield at the correct time. Attacking and defending both use up your stamina gauge. Kind of a weird comparison to make, but it reminds me of that Dragon Quest game for Wii, Masked Queen and the Tower of Mirrors. There's like one person watching this video who just jumped for joy when I said the name of that game. Anyway, it seems like an enjoyable little romp, but not a Kingsfield romp. Okay, I guess it's a bit like Kingsfield. While Kingsfield Additional may be obscure little games for most of us, at least you can find and play them. Far more odd and far more sought after are the Kingsfield mobile games. That's right, across 2004 and 2005, FromSoftware released a number of Kingsfield games for cell phones. I just can't imagine anything more excruciating than playing Kingsfield on a fucking phone. Sadly, imagining is all we can do. Nobody has uploaded a playable copy of them onto the internet, if they've even been archived at all. The first game appears to be a straight port or simplified remake of the original game. Kingsfield EX appears to be an original experience, with From bragging about new and exciting one-way doors. That just seems horrible. Does Kingsfield need doors that lock from one side? Kingsfield Mobile 2 looks to be quite an impressive upgrade, both graphically and in terms of gameplay. Unfortunately, we only have some very small screenshots and GIFs from the Wayback Machine to showcase them. One might say that the Kingsfield series died not with a bang, but with a whimper. But that wouldn't be accurate. From its very first entry, the story of Kingsfield is one of lineage, a passing of the torch from the old guard to the next generation. When a king is young, he may be strong, ambitious, courageous, and loyal, but kings are men, and men grow old. They become frail, their wit may dull, and they might even go mad. It's not a matter of if, but when. There comes a day when their sons must assume those responsibilities, the end of an era, if you will, the start of something new. The lessons taught by Kingsfield are numerous. Be brave in the face of danger. Don't despair in the presence of fear. Stand your ground and know when to strike. Be humble. When you lay defeated, don't curse your lot, but ask yourself if there's a lesson to be learned. Be adaptable. Becoming fixated on one strategy can lose us sight of our arsenal. We cannot direct the wind, but we can adjust our sails. be determined. The truest wisdom in this world is a spirit made resolute. Don't let them take your heart of gold from you. These lessons imparted, Kingsfield perished so that the Souls games could live. I believe most would agree that Souls has surpassed its predecessor in a way that would inspire pride. Hidetaka Miyazaki deserves a tremendous amount of credit for directing Demon Souls when it seemed destined for failure. It's credit that's been given in spades. Video game celebrity is an interesting thing. Some do anything they can to achieve it, for others it simply falls into their lap. But in either case, it's rare. It's difficult for us to comprehend what a colossal effort game development is, so the mental real estate most of us have for video game industry people is limited. In a perfect world, we'd remember every name of every person who contributed to the games we loved, but alas, this is not a perfect world. For this, and for many other reasons, I wanted to honor the effort of FromSoftware's old guard. Naotoshi Jin, Shinichiro Nishida, Aichi Hasegawa, they all quietly changed video game history. Even if you haven't played their games, you're very likely a beneficiary of their work. Their artistic sensibilities are felt not only in From's games, but so many others even today. From their unique method of delivering dialogue to the player, to their penchant for clever shortcuts and connecting passages, to their focus on brutal but strangely addicting challenge. Kingsfield's influence is not only present in the games of today, you can hardly get away from it. With the propagation of Souls-like games as popular as ever, it seems FromSoftware has created a proverbial monster. The chances that we'll be getting a new Kingsfield game are slim, to say the least. When asked about such a possibility, Miyazaki stated that Dark Souls and Kingsfield are entirely separate entities. He's not interested in directing a new entry in the Kingsfield series because he fears it would only be a pale imitation. The series, he says, is the brainchild of Naotoshi Jin, and the development of a sequel would be contingent on Jin returning as director. Even with the influence Kingsfield has had in his own work, Miyazaki has too much respect for the dormant series to puppeteer its corpse. Still, with long-running FromSoftware series continuing to receive entries, a future where we see a Kingsfield sequel or reboot isn't impossible. Often, new entries in long-dormant series serve only to remind us that nostalgia is a hell of a drug. Some things are best left as rose-tinted memories, rather than being retrofit in a world that no longer accommodates them. But of all the developers I trust to make good on their promise, FromSoftware is close to the top. They've stayed remarkably consistent with the tentpoles of their design established in the 1990s. They've grown, they've learned, and they've innovated, but they've never compromised on their vision. That has proved an unconventional but undeniably fruitful pathway to success. Exploring the foundations of that success has been one of the most fulfilling projects I've undertaken for this channel. When I started playing Kingsfield, I expected it to be a silly little curiosity, maybe good fodder for a death compilation. I mean, I guess it was that too. But at every turn, I found myself surprised by elegance buried underneath its minimalistic design. In many ways, it mirrored the experience I had when Dark Souls first clicked with me. I went from angry at skeletons to admiring the subtle genius that had manifested in this skeleton-inhabited world. We only sit in the shade of the Erd Tree today because Kingsfield planted that seed 30 years ago. Okay, hold on, there's gotta be a better way to fit a quote in here. If you're patient and interested in partaking in one of video game history's more understated revolutions, I do recommend playing the Kingsfield series. Based on their own merits, they're all wonderfully atmospheric, satisfying to explore, and surprisingly fun to play after a bit of a learning curve. Each one brings something new to the table, no two are the same, and that's helped each one carve out their own little place amongst each other. If they're a little too hard, a little too obtuse, a little too old for you, hey, don't sweat it. You can appreciate them from afar, and you can appreciate their influence from up close. There are plenty of indie developers who have either released or are working on Kingsfield-like games. If nothing else, it's clear that people still remember Kingsfield fondly. There's still a place for this series in the hearts and minds of many. Long live the king. Long live Kingsfield. Thanks so much for watching this video. I had a lot of fun making and writing it, so I hope you enjoyed it. I would like to extend my gratitude to patrons who make such videos possible. And now for some patron questions. I'd go with Pierce Brosnan, even though I know most of his Bond movies are very, very bad. He's always kind of just captured the essence of Bond for me. Aw, man. I don't know if he's like the best, but my favorite's always been Baron Samedi. I like the slight supernatural bend he gave to the film. It was fun. I go through phases. Sometimes I read voraciously. Other times I'm really bad at letting my phone distract me before bed, which is bad, I know. I do most of my reading when I'm researching for a video. I go with Jupiter. Wind magic usually is kind of lame, but when lightning is included in it, it's instantly elevated to S tier status. I always pick lightning stuff. I'd love to see a new Time Splitters game, but really specifically for the co-op campaign. That series has a sort of unadulterated chaos that I feel like is missing from a lot of modern multiplayer games. I'd like to extend a very warm thank you to those in my Persons of Lordly Caliber tier on Patreon. Adam Safranco, Matthew Sean Dick, Sleepy, Avil and Hime Takamura, True Manalist, Spencer Kennelly, Smo Bun, I'm Emil Castagne's #1 fan, Captain, BB Squirrel, Shane Shack, Mr. Shifty, Buster Drew, Francois, Fanar, Fenrir Lives, Silvar, Xenogears, Olo Shadow, Guko, Jordan Laughlin, Jordan Miller, Hayden Hudson, Rocketman, Jay Hewen, Azure Midsummer, Destrega, Tepatag Tournament, F, James Adair, Sable Dragon Rook, Cameron himself, Einel Hander, Kelly Slaughter, Zeta, Caleb the Wanderer, Nicholas Esposito, Stephen Clancy, Shu, Believe in the Net, and Isaac Hampton. Still able to read it in one breath, but hey, don't let that stop you from signing up. Anyway, all of you are angels, I say. I appreciate each and every one of you, honestly. This video was both fun to make and a lot of work, so if you'd like to fund further videos such as this, perhaps think about pledging to my Patreon. On top of bonus videos and early access to videos, there are a variety of Discord benefits and other goodies, so please consider it. Once again, thank you all for watching, and until I see you next time, stay healthy, wealthy, and wise.